Distinguished scholar and participants, welcome to a very special webinar on webinar of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation Engagement on bringing indigenous experiences, theories, and philosophies into international relations. At today's session, we aim to explore parallel or new indigenous theories which can be related into political science in general and international relations in particular. For instance, King Prithvi Shah's Dibyoupadesh, Kautilya's Arthashastra, Sun Tzu's The Art of War, Buddha's Panchsheel, and several others. Amsu Burma, who ruled Nepal, in fact, even before Nepal was formed as a state, during the 7th century, he got his sister Bhoga Devi married to an Indian king, and Indian king Sursen and his daughter Vrikriti married to a Tibetan king Sangsang Gampo. That is how he protected his kingdom. The 18th century King Prithvi Shah, who unified Nepal in his Dibyoupadesh, stated that Nepal is a yam between two boulders, India and China. He also mentioned that Praja Moto Bharat Darbar Balya Huncha, which means if the people are capable, then the palace will also remain stronger. I think the geopolitics of Nepal is no different from the time of Amsu Burma or Prithvi Shah. Hence, I think it is necessary to have it is not necessary to have Western theories to explain Nepal's foreign policy or its behavior in international politics. The foreign policy of Nepal, India, China, and even the United Nations Charter is strongly influenced by Panchsheel. The work of Kautilya, Sun Tzu, and others are really remarkable. However, these theories are studied more like a theology, religion, culture, philosophy, and moral science. There is a need to implement these theories, experiences, and philosophies in international relations, in security studies, and in foreign policy. Western theories and experiences are important, but at the same time, it is necessary to rejuvenate our old theories. This is the major purpose of this webinar. We wish to organize it in series. Hence, please write to us if you wish to contribute to this initiative. We'd also like to produce a 1,000 to 1,500 words article on this and come up with a special report because at NICE, we'd like to document and put everything on record. Each and every discussion is recorded and broadcasted and shared on our YouTube channel. We want to put it on writing as well. We'll be glad to know that all our previous lectures are being transcribed and we will be coming up in the form of book. This webinar is in 2 sessions. The first session is on Statecraft and Manusmriti, Krishna's and war theory, Prithvi Shah's Dibyoupadesh, Sun Tzu's Art of War, Buddha's Panchsheel, Confucian economy, Mahabharata, and several others. The second session will be on Kautilya. To chair this first session, we have Dr. Medha Bisht. Dr. Medha Bisht is a senior assistant professor at South Asian University. She holds a PhD from Diplomatic Studies Division, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She has also worked with Mohan Parikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis as a research associate. She has authored Kautilya's Arthashastra, Philosophy and Strategy that we'll be discussing in the second session of this conference. She has conducted several research on hydro diplomacy of South Asia with stakeholders engagements. Dr. Bisht, we are really thankful for your time and for agreeing to chair this session. We'll have around 110 minutes for this session because we have roughly lost 10 minutes. The program is streaming live on Facebook and other social media platforms. Please do share the link and tweet about this event. Thank you, and over to you, Medha.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal. It's really an immense pleasure being here and, in fact, hosting, chairing this session. This is, as you all know, a 2-hour session. We have around 11 papers, which is huge, which is a huge panel by any standards, I would say. So I would say because we have around 110 minutes, around 11 papers, maybe we could give around 8 minutes each to every presenter. And this would leave us, say, with around 20 odd minutes, which could be for interaction, which could include my own intervention, it could include my own interventions in the subject. Now, I would say that, being a chair of this session, I think when first you proposed me this idea, I felt both privileged, but I also felt pretty contemplated. I felt privileged because I get to moderate and give some perspective to these ideas. And I felt contemplative because essentially we are not historians or philologists. We, however, are approaching these issues as students of international relations, which I would say is a fairly recent discipline, almost 100 years old, where theories of international relations were primarily influenced by Western experiences and Western intellectual thought. So looking at non-Western thought and sources, I would say offers definitely an opportunity to engage critically, not only with some of the mainstream theories in international relations, but it also gives us an opportunity to add on to the critical international relations theory, which I would say often challenge the territorial and the statist interpretation of international relations. So I do hope that in this session, we see both the mainstream and the critical contribution that non-Western sources or indigenous thought can make. Now, when I looked at the schedule, Pramod, I thought that, there are a lot of papers one after another. And if I would use really my prerogative as a chair, I would actually like to reorganize this panel around texts, themes, and thinkers. And I thought that, maybe this kind of a division would really help us to really understand what the speakers are really going to say, rather than just move on with in a chronological manner. So if you bear with me here, we can perhaps have a set of speakers who would be speaking under the text theme, the second under the themes, and the third under the thinkers. Under the texts, we have Dr. Himanshu Roy, we have Ambassador Basnyat, and we have Dr. Nitika Ladda, who will be speaking and taking the cases of Manusmriti, Dibyoupadesh, and Mahabharata in particular. Under the theme sections, I would say we have Dr. Amna Mirza, we have Dr. Pranata Bhattarai, Mr. Surendra Raval, and Mr. Anand Sri Kumar, who would look at how indigenous sources, thinkers can really humanize IR. And here we would be looking at Gandhian and Buddhist thought. And I would say that under thinkers, we have Dr. Tamanna Khosla, we have Dr. Gaurav Bhattarai, and Mr. Manish Gulami, who will be looking at thinkers ranging from Kautilya, from Krishna, to Sun Tzu, to Confucius, around which then they will be engaging around issues related to war, strategy, and economy. So maybe, in this way, we can do justice to this very eclectic panel, which I am sure has a lot of wisdom to offer. And I would say with this brief curtain raiser, let me invite the first speaker, Professor Himanshu Roy. You all have 8 minutes, maybe around the 7th minute, I'll give you a reminder to wind up the arguments. And I think then we'll have a good space for discussion and a Q&A conversation on those lines. So Professor Himanshu Roy, over to you, please.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Pranav, for this invitation. The theme is Manusmriti, and the focus is on the statecraft. Usually, we do not associate Manusmriti with the statecraft. We associate a statecraft only with Kautilya, not Tiruvalluvar, not Vatsayan, not Kamandak, and so many others are there who have spoken a lot on the statecraft in the Indic traditions, in the Indic civilizational mold, which has become now, or going to become in another 5-10 years, a dominant mainstream traditions, rather than calling like colonial a native or indigenous. It was their dominance for 200 years almost, that we became the indigenous and the native who were dominating once upon a time the world economy, where the 1/4 of the GDP of the world was with India, part of the Indic civilization. I have dealt at length in my forthcoming book, which will be out in October by Sage, Political Thought in Indic Civilization. You can have a look, the introduction part in particular. But anyway, let me begin with this Manusmriti. It has been also called as, and this is available, Manav Dharma Shastra. Not much difference with Kautilya, not much difference with Kamandak on the Saptang theory that we all are familiar with, and Medha has worked on it as far as I understand and know. I heard 15 days ago, approximately, when she was speaking on one of the platform of Baroda University, Atal Bihari Vajpayee Center. And she spoke well. So Saptang theory, I won't repeat. As good as Swami, Amat, and Janpada, Rashtra, etc., Durga and Kos, Dand, Mitra, the 7 elements that constitutes the state. It's as good as Kautilya, Arthashastra. The problem here with the Indian texts, and that is more important to know, because we have slotted certain texts in certain mold, that we do not have the time fixed when it was written, who was the person who wrote it, at what date and time it was written. For example, even when the political Islam came, we have the different texts and the dates and the days or the years, the Hijri era. Here we don't find even the Samvat era. So it's very difficult to fix when it was written. I mean the contextualization of the Indian text in pre-Islamic period. That's one of the tragic part of the textual aspects of the Indic civilization. Then the 5 principles of appointment of the Council of Ministers, again the similar that Kautilya wrote, the ability of the minister and their passing out of the examinations, then the bravery or the courage and the objectivity to judge it, etc. These are the 5 principles that Manu mentions it. Then he talks about the interstate relations, that the mandala theory that Kautilya also talks about, and the 6 principles that he talks about, like Sandhi, Vigra, and the neutrality, the peace, etc., and the war, etc. The major difference which is of interest, since the time limit has been given only to 7-8 minutes, and I hope it doesn't include question answer sessions here, rather the only presentations. It's on the part of the diplomacy. The major difference is that Kautilya is expansionist in the mold. Territorial annexation, he can go as far as possible. The economy and the statecraft, the art permits. Manu here is on the contrary, not expansionist. He is not so explicit in the Sanskrit sloka, and the total verses that he has written, which is available to us right now, is around 2,765 verses in which the Manusmriti is written. P.V. Kane argues that there are a lot of interpolations, etc. And therefore, we do not know exactly what is the verses written by whether Manu himself or someone else, and whether actual the size of the Manusmriti is only 2,765 verses or more or less. But he says, and we know Kane as the authoritative person who spent his 35 years in writing Dharmasastra traditions, starting from 1925-30 onwards. So the major difference, more diplomatic here, is that there is the idea of territorial annexation in Kautilya. As I said earlier, he believes in expansionism, the theory of expansionism, if the situation permits. Manu doesn't believe in. Here is the major difference. Now the point is, both these theories, if we make a comparison between Kautilya and Manu, it has, in the different circumstances, suited the Indian statecraft. Most of the times in Indic civilizations, we have not been expansionists in the written history that we say written, as far as we know. But many times we find, and it has been a civilizational discourse, we find the Indian statecrafts under the different monarchs have been expansionists. So both are Vyavhar Paksh because they are using the word Vyavhar Paksh. Manu here is focusing on the balance of power, looking at his neighbors, but yet not expansionist. This is the major difference between the two. Then, surprisingly, which goes against this gender discourse and the feminist discourse that the feminist or the Dalit activists they have been arguing, using Manusmriti as the major textbook. Here, let me argue that Manusmriti has never been the major textbook in pre-colonial Indic civilization. It was William Jones who interpreted certain texts according to his requirements of the colonial rule that distorted the meaning of the many verses. It was more interpolations through his interpretations. So woman enjoys a major share of property rights. The other important aspects of Manusmriti is the Vyavhar Pad, that is called the classification of laws. And there are 18 heads under which all the laws have been classified, and therefore Nietzsche called is the major book on the classification of the law. And through this Manusmriti, you'll be surprised to know that Nietzsche is hitting out against Christianity in Europe at that point of time, after 1790s, when the Manusmriti was translated into English and then in German, in French, etc., etc. And the major heads of classification of laws is theft, assault, defamation, sale, non-payment of wages, non-execution of agreements, adultery. Adultery is one of the most important classification of laws, and particularly chapter 7 discusses very strongly about the male adultery. So those who argue against, particularly the feminists argue against the patriarchal dominance or talking about the patriarchal dominance of Manusmriti. Here is a person who is writing very strongly against male adultery. And finally, the other important aspect is the justice. He talks at length the idea of justice in Manusmriti. And the idea of justice means not only the property rights to women, but as per the merit of the case. Yes, it was a common argument at that point of time. And let me clarify before I move further that Brahmanism was not a caste. It was a profession. For example, Upadhyay means assistant professor. And Upadhyay of a Chato village in Bengal means Chattopadhyay. Mahamukhopadhyay is a professor. Mukhopadhyay is associate professor.
You start winding up your arguments, Professor Roy. Please.
Yes. So colonial Raj makes it a sort of caste, links it with the caste. Here, when he talks about justice, and it's a political economy that the Manusmriti is, when he talks about justice, here the focus is that as per the merit, except the academicians, the educateds, the Brahmins should not be hanged. It's again, I say, not a caste, but an academicians who have committed some mistakes should not be hanged. And this is corroborated by the Carmelite Austrian missionary who came into Malabar, stayed there for 13 years, and wrote about the Indic civilization. So with this, I wind up, and thank you, Medha, once again.
Thank you very much, Professor Roy. And I think most of the ideas are worth deliberation. two takeaways from this talk, very important takeaways, that we need to look at the pre-Kautilyan thought and the post-Kautilyan thought. And the second thing, which I think, which really came out, is that, rather than being text-centric, I think what we really need to do is to be tradition-centric when we are really looking at Indic thought. So with that, we move on to the second speaker, Ambassador Basnyat. He's a former Nepalese diplomat, and he will be enlightening us on Prithvi Narayan Shah's Dibyoupadesh. Ambassador Basnyat, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you, madam, and thanking Dr. Pramod Jaiswal. I start my presentation. King Prithvi Narayan Shah was the first king of Shah dynasty of Nepal, and he was from Gorkha, very small state with 12,000 households at that time, when he became king in 1743. He was born in 1723, and at the age of 20, he became the king, and he died in January 1775. So his lifespan was 52 years, and he actually gave this Upadesh. Many historians say that it is Dibyoupadesh, but I prefer to call it Upadesh only, because when we say Dibya, that means divine, something God is associated with. So actually he was a human being, and he was a very brave man and also visionary leader. So he unified 52 small kingdoms, and bigger than his own kingdom also, he fought and won. And first kingdom he won was Makwanpur, and that was bigger than Gorkha in every aspect, in a military, in a territorial, and in terms of richness also. It was a bigger. And then another biggest victory he had was Kathmandu Valley. In Kathmandu Valley, there were 3 states, city states. They are called Kathmandu, Patan, and Bhaktapur. So after he unified, annexed Bhaktapur in 1769, first phase of Nepal's unification was completed. So he unified 52 small kingdoms. Now we talk about his Dibyoupadesh. Before he died, I think that he started giving this Upadesh to his courtiers, to all of his officials, military, civilians at his palace. And he was ill at that time. And in December 1774, he fell sick, and then in January 1775, he died. So I guess that he has started giving this Upadesh 2 weeks before his death. Now I go on to Dibyoupadesh. What is there in that Dibyoupadesh? Dibyoupadesh was found in one of his courtiers' house in Kathmandu, and which is called a military house or Paltan Ghar. So in that Paltan Ghar, this original copy was found, written in a Nepali paper and handwritten, and it is about 9 pages in handwriting. So this document is immensely important for Nepal, because it is the Upadesh given by the creator of the country, unifier of the country. So this was actually never known. He had written for a long time, about 150 years. Nobody knew that this text existed. But it was found in 1930s in one of the houses of his courtiers, and only it was published after the Rana regime was overthrown in 1951. So it was published in its entirety, and now people knew that what his views in many issues. So I think for international relations also, it can be a very good document. And he has talked about foreign policy, and he has talked about the power empires of that time. Like there was a Chinese emperor who ruled in his time in China about 59 years. That is, his name was Qian Yong. Qian Yong. So he ruled for 59 years, and at that time, Prithvi Shah was in Kathmandu, ruling the country. So mm, in India, it was a East India Company, which came actually after the victory in the War of Plassey in 1757. Actually, East India Company gained grounds and expanded, and all the Nawabs were, controlled or owned. And finally, after the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857, in 1858, Queen Victoria declared that all the territories belonging to East India Company now belong to the British Empire. So in 1858, so that was happened in India. So I was giving some points in Indian also history. But the Dibyoupadesh was very important because it talks about Nepal and being Nepal a small country between the two empires, one in the south, East India Company at that time, and one in the north, Chinese Empire. So Prithvi Shah, he said that do not go in an offensive attack, and only attack others if they do not if they attack you. If they don't attack you, don't attack them. So that is also some sort of non-aligned type of foreign policy is there. So he said that don't attack your stronger enemy, because you will be owned by them. So that's why he said, don't attack the enemy who is stronger than you. And you have to negotiate with them if they are stronger. So he asked to negotiate with East India Company and the Chinese Emperor, because he said that Nepal is like a yam. Yam is like this sweet potato, but it's not exactly sweet potato, which is found in Nepal. We call it tarul. So Nepal is like a tarul, yam, in between two rocks. So we have to be very careful, so we are in the middle. So he has said like that. And then he also said that.
1 minute left, Ambassador Basnyat. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So I will finish very shortly. And actually, he has given all the how to consolidate military, how to distribute land to the military, how to raise the fund for the economy and the country, how to further expand the country. So only aim of King Prithvi Shah was to protect and advance his core national interest at that time. So he gave this Upadesh council to his future king, that is his sons and grandsons and all other courtiers who supported him to create Nepal. So Nepal was created, actually Nepal is one of the independent countries, very ancient independent countries. When there are only 17 countries in the world, Nepal was there. So I would like to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry to be a very strict timekeeper, but those are the instructions which are given to me. And maybe we can move on to the third speaker, Dr. Nikita Ladda, who will be speaking on warfare ethics and peace through the lens of Mahabharata. I think one of the very important insights which come from Dibyoupadesh are the tactics and the stratagems which are mentioned there. And I think when we're looking at these ancient texts, we also need to look at the strategic wisdom that stems from it. So over to you, Dr. Nikita Ladda.
Thank you, ma'am. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you, NICE, for organizing this very interesting conference. And so the title of my paper is, as has been mentioned by Medha, ma'am, Ethics of Warfare and Peace Through the Lens of Mahabharata. So without much ado, I would like to begin my paper. So I'll begin with two quotes. The first quote is actually from Mahabharata. Whatever is here that is found elsewhere, but what is not here is nowhere else. And the other quote that is, it would not be an exaggeration to say that the people of India have learned to think and act in terms of the Mahabharata. So given the limitation of time that is there, I'm going to look at very few events, and I'm going to talk about how the epic is actually a great learning lesson. So as we all know, the Mahabharata is the most vivid illustration of Indian thoughts on statecraft, war, peace and negotiation, and while it is also an inquiry into the human condition. The text is about real-life human choices and its inherent consequences, and at the heart of Mahabharata lies the question of dharma and ahimsa, which are actually very interestingly being discussed from the perspective of violence. The range of text is wide, and it runs into the themes concerning the fragility of human existence, sense of duty, sanctity of obligations, while also discussing at length the dilemmas of statecraft, the question of right action, the ethics of peace, and whether a just war or a war is at all desirable or not. The story, as we know, is about two warring brothers, the Kauravas and Pandavas, and thus, because it talks about war, in the ancient India, it has very significantly offers very important lessons in the art of strategy, negotiation, and bargaining, which are very aptly applicable in the contemporary times as well. Keeping the interest of the nation and securing goals through various means is the dharma of a righteous warrior, and that is something that we even see in the contemporary times today, where the call of self-interest and self-preservation of any country is obviously given primacy. In the Mahabharata, the character of Arjun and of course that of Krishna, moreover, is reflective of a true warrior and a negotiator who are supposed to face the responsibilities in the battlefield despite the consequences. And the story between Krishna and Arjun is of utmost importance because it talks about how taking of war, how doing your right action is obviously the most important thing to do, no matter what the price or no matter what the consequences would be of the same. So the narrative engages in detailed discussion on the logic of power and its application in a contested environment, and calls for strategic patience in hostile situations. Through the Kauravas, the overuse of power is seen to have resulted in absolute annihilation, and thus the text is also highly instructive on the judicious use of expanding power, on the judicious use of ever-expanding power. The consequence of war ever surpasses the supposed good that comes out, and as it is said in Mahabharata, there is no good in war, dear son, nor any holding together in the foundation of life. Where can there be war in any happiness? Nor is there any certainty of victory in every war. Yet, while the epic alerts us about the futility of war and how the victorious suffers as well, yet the text is a very important standing testament that a just war is very important, especially when the cost of constant restraint becomes highly dangerous. And thus, what is important to note is that in the Mahabharata, one of the most important strategy is that the war should be avoided no matter what the cost. And even before the start of the war, the Pandavas, on the behest of Yudhishthir, actually sent Krishna to Duryodhan so as to be the ambassador of the peace, so as to he should be the negotiator so that the war could be avoided. But Duryodhan refuses the peace management and agrees for a war, and the war happens for 18 days. And it is when the final peace mission fails that the preparation of war with great care and utmost precision with the right kind of army and personal participation becomes very important. The role of Krishna as a strategist and negotiator on the side of Pandavas proved to be game-changing, which was an outcome of a smart decision-making by Arjun, wherein he chooses Krishna over his personal army for the war. Because for Arjun, enhancing competitiveness in the war without ignoring the established areas of capacity was vital, and the same can be replicated even in the contemporary context. So while preparing the orthodox route is important in any war, yet what is crucial is to gain leverage over the opponent and to enhance one's capabilities. And I think in the contemporary times, this can be done via the use of artificial intelligence, robotics, data analytics, or sensing advanced materials and surveillance. Now, another thing that Mahabharata has always called into, while the Bhagavad Gita is a very important testament to the right action, to following the right cause, and Yudhishthira is always known as the son of Dharma, but the Mahabharata also holds numerous examples of violations of codes of conduct, some more flagrant than the others. As Draupadi says to Yudhishthira, there is now no excuse or opportunity to show forgiveness towards the Kauravas. Now is the time to use force, and the only strategy that you should imply towards them is of force. So the central theme that the epic ponders upon is whether a war is avoidable, and if you go ahead and take part in a war, what discourse, what course should you follow? Right before the outbreak of the war, Arjun, who's one of the most ablest of the warriors from the Pandava side, is overcome with doubt, remorse, and confusion. What gain could possibly be had from destroying one's own kinsmen is the doubt that constantly clouds Arjun's mind. Gauging the futility of war, he sets his bow and arrow aside, refusing to fight, and turns to Krishna for help. This happens in the text to be a very important signifier of persuasion and negotiation deployed by Krishna to address the moral considerations of Arjun. While Krishna talked about the timeless soul, he also provided the moral justification for Arjun's role in the war, urging him to choose the path of detached action rather than renunciation. As he says, focus always on your actions, but never on the fruits of your actions. The reward should not be the purpose of your action, nor should you allow yourself to be tempted by inaction. So the above episode speaks of the moral necessity of the war and doing the right action in times of exigencies, thus giving primacy to the duty of an individual with an absolute stress on performing the right karma. Now, what we see therefore in Mahabharata is that all players use practices and traditions to their advantage, and the Mahabharata is no different. I'm just going to mention some of the episodes in which Mahabharata was very ably reflecting that if you need to bring down the opponent at times, going beyond the just means is absolutely welcome. So be it Indra who disguised as Brahmin to take away the earrings of Karna, or the killing of Duryodhan below the belt, or Abhimanyu being trapped in the Chakravyuh and being killed from the rear, or the removal of Dronacharya by lying about the death of his son, or the death of Jadar at the hands of Arjun, or in the way Ashwathama decides to wipe out the entire army of Pandava at the end. All of these speak of treachery and deceit instead of strategic restraint being necessary on the war. So what the epic is trying to tell us is that unjustness is welcome, and forgiveness and reconciliation at times is not the most welcome of decision, because you have to adopt strategies of gentleness and harshness depending on the requirement of the particular situation, and only then you will be able to achieve happiness. Yes, non-violence is not the right way, because aggression only brings aggression and violence only brings violence. As much as peace and reconciliation is welcome, as is reflected by the character of Yudhishthir, but what is also important is to make sure that revenge and forgiveness acquire important attention, and both of them should be steeped in ethics. Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Nikita, for keeping up to the time. And definitely, I think these micro stories from Mahabharata definitely urge us to look at the meaning of war, peace, in a much more broader sense, as they are understood generally in the discipline of international relations. When we move on, I would say, to the next section of this panel, where we'll be looking at certain themes. And I would like to invite Dr. Amna Mirza, who is an assistant professor, University of Delhi, and she will be speaking on reimagining rationality in IR with human-centric ethos of indigenous narratives. Over to you, Dr. Amna.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Great, thank you. Once again, my greetings to everyone present with us for this very interesting deliberative session, which has been presented to us by Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Development. Gratitude, Dr. Jaiswal. It was wonderful indeed. It's been a great time listening and learning further from my teachers at the university, respected Professor Himanshu Roy, sir, listening from Ambassador, sir. My greetings to our chair, Dr. Medha, and greetings and gratitude, Dr. Anna. Friends, I will be presenting on a very significant topic, that is reimagining rationality in international relations with human-centric ethos of the indigenous narrative. At the very outset, Dr. Medha rightly pointed out that it is very essential to not only look at the text, but also look at the bigger message these classical texts have for the contemporary scenario. Now, when I talk about international relations, once again, this becomes very pertinent to understand that the idea of the realm of international relations has been defined by the word of rationality. Now, when we look at rationality again carries various meanings. And one of the important meanings that rationality carries forward is that there is a belief that actors will perform in a manner catering to the best possible outcome. Rationality in the realm of international relations has been seen as a methodological approach, and also it's very essential that when we situate the various debates of international relations, right from idealism to realism, from behavioralism to methods of sciences to rationalism versus reflectivism, and the inter-paradigm debate, in all of it, there is a very strong emphasis on the aspect that the domain of international relations demands a very pragmatic approach. And this pragmatic approach is needed to safeguard the national interest. Friends, in this slide, this brings us to the next aspect, which we all have highlighted, that when we look at the discipline of international relations, no doubt there has been a bias. It could be in terms of the literature available, it could be in terms of ideas available for comprehension. And when we look at the rational choice debate, namely looking at it as a prominent perspective about conditions that could guide the actions, the balance was tilted towards a realist mainstream perspective. You're all aware about it, that the idea of statism, self-help, survival. Now, nobody disputes the narrative that state is indeed one of the main caretakers of the national interest for a particular nation state. Similarly, nobody disputes that the idea that the state must be guided by national interest. However, crude emphasis on the idea that pragmatism should be devoid of any kind of morality or a welfare agenda is something that must be critiqued in this framework. Friends, as we are trying to reimagine and try to look at indigenous narrative, I think the ideas of Kautilya presented in the views are presented in Arthashastra indeed not only present to us some very important dynamics of statecraft, but also present to us a model of governance which give emphasis. And herein, in the realm of IR, one would really like to point towards two things. Firstly, the welfare state model, and secondly, giving emphasis to knowledge. So once again, as we reread through the various ideas presented in Kautilya's Arthashastra, pointing towards the duties of the king, giving space to no regard, giving absolute total disregard for any kind of corruption. And most important, as we read through Kautilya's Arthashastra, there is a very important aspect that we must highlight, that there was no emphasis on expansionist ethos. There was no emphasis towards war or any tendency, to get hold of the territory of the other. there was concern for the interests of the state, but not in the sense of the loot and plunder. Similarly, when we are reading indigenous narratives, a very important indigenous narrative comes to us from the ideas and the ideas of Lord Buddha, wherein he says that the mind is everything, or perhaps Lord Buddha's call that in compassion lies the world's greatest strength. Friends, as we reread through these indigenous narratives, let's now go towards the most important part, that is the context of contemporary international relations. We all know that security and national interests are indeed supreme pillars to guide any state activity in the domain of global governance. But having said so, one can also not ignore that how security, national interests are multidimensional. Just to take a cue from what the speaker before me presented, Nikita ji absolutely pointed out so well that how the domain of warfare too, when we look at artificial intelligence, technology, robotics, indeed that is witnessing change. So here we see that the context of international relations is much more contested than what it was when we look at the past. So in this times of contestation, another interesting scenario in the domain of international relations here is that the central questions remain the same. It is the state that is supposed to be looking after the security and national interests of the state, and also this has to be worked in a manner ensuring that it's the state's interest which has to be given ultimate supremacy. Now, friends, as we are looking at this reimagining the global governance framework, let me draw your attention towards the contemporary world event. We reflect, and for that we reflect on the G20 virtual summit. As we all know, G20 has a rotating presidency as an intergovernmental negotiating forum. It has a representation from important world powers and important nations of the world. And in the recent G20 World Summit, allow me to draw your attention towards the report of the Ministry of External Affairs, wherein the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke about that there is a need to conceptualize globalization with humanity at center. International relations, the various processes, phenomena, ideas, indeed are contested, and one of the domains of this contestation comes from the Western bias, which define rationality. The first point of our paper, which we try to invoke, which try to define rationality from a non-human perspective, which tried to define rationality in a manner which was devoid of human norms. So once again, this is remarked that we have to redefine globalization, looking at the context of present-day reality. Allow me to quote from this G20 virtual summit, where the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi ji pointed out that in many scenarios, globalization has failed us. If G20 had become a forum to balance competing individual interests rather than looking at the collective individuals of all human kind. Once again, the speech is available at Ministry of External Affairs, 26 March 2020, just to authenticate my data. We all know, I'm Dr. Medha, I'll just finish. We all know, friends, that today, reality, the context of world governance demands a new narrative. We're talking about a new framework of globalization 4.0. We're looking at a future wherein virus has been uncertain and disrupting all forms of global governance. Herein, I think the world community is looking for new ideas. The domain of international relations has indeed, has seen that there was a prevalence of one kind of thinking over the other. The change time demand that earlier looking that we must look at the important aspects of welfare and the need to have quest towards knowledge in a way to cater better to realities of global governance. We need new pragmatic strategic perspective and indigenous narratives from Kautilya's Shastra focusing on the welfareist agenda to Buddha's Panchsheel focusing on the need to have compassion are indeed very important variables to have a better approach to global governance problem, which indeed demand a holistic approach narrative. So with this, once again, I can see that, we have the time constraint. Once again, gratitude to everyone at NICE, and gratitude to our chairperson, Dr. Medha, for giving me the opportunity and present my views. Thank you.
Thank you so much, I think, for those wonderful ideas. And I'm sure there will be a lot of questions regarding that. But I think one of the main point which really came in was, moving from rationality to relationality, and what contribution to humanism can non-Western resources essentially make. So with that, we move on to the next speaker, Mr. Pranata Bhattacharya, who is an assistant professor in Bankura University. And we're talking about Buddha's Panchsheel and its relevance through trajectories of world peace. Over to you, Dr. Pranata.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, organizers, for this wonderful academic event. Without much ado, I would like to shift to my academic understanding about the indigenous theories. And I'm going to talk about Buddha's Panchsheels and its relevance in the trajectories of peace. I'm not going into the details of Buddha's Panchsheel because already it has been discussed. So basically, my standpoint is theoretically Buddhism can be compared to the world peace theories, as Buddhism and Buddha's Panchsheel significantly emphasized peaceful coexistence, the idea which was accepted worldwide and the purview of UN peacekeeping and peacemaking efforts. Buddha's Panchsheel remained the guiding principle, as we all know, India-China relationship and the famous Panchsheel Treaty. And obviously, we can see that India's soft power diplomacy and projection of soft power balancing methods, that is also guided by Buddha's Panchsheel. And always Indian government has emphasized importance of the peaceful coexistence and importance of so-called Panchamrit Niti and Panchsheel ideas. In fact, theoretical conception of international security can be approximated to Buddha's Panchsheel. Maximum theories argued for peaceful coexistence and international society, which is also linked with the emancipation producing a particular world order. We can see Kratochvil argued in favor of responsible methodological pluralism, which is also part of reinterference or reprojection of the legacy of Panchsheel. In Republican China, we can also see Buddhism for the human realm got famous for its peaceful theoretical and practical standpoint. Moreover, there are networks like Engage Buddhism, which is actually working like activism, which is like working as activists of emancipation, expansion of Buddhism in Southeast Asia, and played a major role in the soft power diplomacy and also keeping a peaceful balance in the region. Engaged Buddhism is also socially engaged, extremely politically concerned about the tolerance and the socio-economic movement, which is also related to sustainable economic development. It started from 1950s, and basically it was first coined by Vietnamese Thien Mon Tin Nan Tha, and it is actually advocated in 1926, but ultimately the movement got spread into all over the world, and ultimately it was accepted by the many Southeast Asian countries, including South Asian countries like India. Buddhist Panchsheel was not just a tool to keep peace, but its tenets were actually used to promote sustainable economic development and a pure nature-oriented social order as well. Buddha's mainstream ideas, which are basically based on the emancipation within the democratic pluralism, So basically, when we find out democratic policies in the entire world and entire world governance system, among these anarchical structure or hierarchy, we can still find out relevance of Buddhism and Buddha's Panchsheel. And in the wake of pandemic, when governments need to cooperate and the non-governmental organization, we are having, security challenges, non-traditional security threats, and regime-related conflicts, and so many small-scale conflicts as well. I think Buddha's Panchsheel is absolutely guiding principle in solving the problems and also the conflict resolution by the peaceful means. So Buddhist ideas are supreme in its resolutions because it is more or less related to the nature, people, and ideas of people's peaceful coexistence and the basic tenets of spirituality, which is omnipresent and omnipotent in the human race. The simple life of Buddhism can be glorified in the pandemic situation to fight worldwide health issues, mental crisis, and emotional crisis of people. And pandemic has already showed us the evils of consumerism, and we are talking about retreating globalization. We are talking about simple life, and I think Buddhist idea of peace, Buddhist Panchsheel, can be our guiding principle. So obviously we can see maintaining a peaceful order in the all over the world scenario, it is absolutely, we can be indebted for this. We can be indebted to Buddhist Panchsheels and Buddhism altogether. So thank you so much. That is all I wanted to say. Over to you, ma'am.
So thank you, and thank you for winding up your presentation well in time. Well, there are certain questions which I feel are there in the box. I think there was one question from Munhata Shoaib. And if you can just type, I would just request you, if you can just type your question in the chat box, that would be very nice. Now we'll move on to the next presenter. Dr. Surendra Singh Rawal. He's a security analyst, and he will be talking about Buddha's Panchsheel.
Thank you, Medha. Am I audible?
Yes, very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank NICE and Dr. Pramod Jaiswal for giving me this opportunity. I'll be talking about Buddha's approach to international relations. People often ask whether there is an alternative to Westphalian model of international relations. I believe a Buddhist approach could provide an alternative to the Western model of IR. Buddha's Panchsheel basically talks about 5 rules for living. The 5 precepts prohibit killing, stealing, lying, sexual misconduct, and intoxication. And each of these precepts has a positive counterpart. And these individual level principles can also be applied to state and higher level. When we talk about mainstream IR theories, self-interest and anarchy consider conflict and violence as natural and ethical behavior among states. And that's a problem. That's a problem for stability. And the next problem is it is Eurocentric that undermines universalism. We know the world is headed for a more diverse, less Western-dominated future. And the traditional international relations theory must expand its conceptual scope to better understand the 21st century. In realist view, or from the Morgenthau's perspective, objective laws of international relations are the inherent violence of human nature, the will to dominate, and the natural competition and warfare among autonomous and sovereign states in an anarchical environment. These are presented as absolute truth, but in reality, This perspective is just only one possible depiction of the world that has a diverse history, geography, and consciousness. Realist emphasizes sovereign state as actors operating in an anarchic environment, meaning there is no central authority to protect states from each other or to guarantee their security. It highlights the enduring tendency for conducting conflict among these autonomous, self-interested states seeking security through self-help. Hence, the war is perfectly normal, ethical, and politics or diplomacy by other means. Another major theoretical school, liberalism, working in the same context and assumptions, identifies ways to mitigate the worst conflicting tendencies of IR, basically through economic exchange, a promotion of democracy, and international institutions. It relaxes some realist assumptions and introduces the concept of interdependence that could facilitate greater cooperation. Despite all these differences, realism and liberalism both embrace a rationalist approach in explaining individual and state. Here, I agree with Dr. Amna on her views on non-human perspective of rationality of the West. Both these two theories maintain that individual as well as states are atomistic, materially real, and self-interested actors. A Buddhist IR, on the other hand, is founded on entirely opposition to all the three claims made by realism and liberalism. Buddhism emphasizes that we are not an atomistic, independent entities, and that when we fully realize this fundamental truth, we understand that our original social character is peaceful and altruistic, not selfish. A Buddhist philosophy offers a different departure point that believes the world is profoundly interdependent. Moreover, it maintains that the failure to appreciate interdependence is the ultimate source of all conflict, including interstate war. Buddhism emphasizes that every functioning thing that we perceive is dependent on its causes and conditions, like a tree that appears to our senses when soil, water, and sunlight come together in a certain manner, and decomposes or disappears when those conditions change. Buddha calls it pratitya samutpada. The doctrine proclaims that reality lacks a fixed, inherent, or essential nature, a concept known as Atma, and that all things are impermanent or anitya. According to Buddhism, the alleged separation is a misconception or ignorance of the nature of reality. The fundamental truth is that there exists a profound interdependence and impermanence of all reality. In short, all other problems, including complex political issues, flow from a basic misunderstanding of the comprehensive interdependence of reality. Buddhism does not disagree with the Western philosopher that self-interest appears to drive most of our behavior, but it does differ on the position regarding the social emotion. It claims that our root nature is fundamentally altruistic, not self-interested. Buddhism emphasizes that human beings only behave in the ways that are selfish if they perceive the real nature of their existence mistakenly, or misperceive the reality. According to Buddhism, the mistaken feeling of duality between them and us feeds our never-ending insecurity and fears. Comprehensive interdependence as the nature of existence is all applicable to everything that is functioning. The Buddhist conception of politics as serving the common good go beyond national, cultural, or other barriers. This does not mean that the state system cannot exist in Buddhism. States actually serve an important function supplying public goods in an equitable manner. Hence, in Buddhism, states may occur, but they are entities that induce for benefit of broader humanity. In relating with other states, hostility and aggression is forbidden, and the cultivation of friendliness and neighborliness and mutually beneficial commerce is prohibited. Actually, from the long-term perspective, aggression does not serve anyone's self-interest. A state could retain its army for defensive purposes, but non-violence is the higher ideal. And Buddha advised against the resort to war as a means of settling international dispute. There is little or no support for just war in Buddhism. In Buddha's opinion, wars only perpetuate a future conflict. In foreign affairs, the state has the obligation not to commit aggression and to cooperate with other states in a spirit of friendliness and equality for the common good of mankind. Let me conclude by saying that Buddha's political doctrine of equality, democracy, popular sovereignties, and political institutions find their ultimate success in a worldwide network of states when each acts according to these principles. Thus, I believe Buddhism can provide an alternative to the Westphalian model of IR. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raval. I can just see in the box here that Dr. Raghavendra Mishra from Jawaharlal Nehru University has raised his hand. I would just request you, Dr. Mishra, to type your question in the chat box, and we'll definitely revert back to you. But thank you, Dr. Raval, for in fact, highlighting the limitations of paradigms in IR and how they are excessively influenced, I would say, by a positivist epistemology. And I think it is here that Buddhist thought does really offer an alternative worldview. But how do we actually operationalize it in terms of the challenges that I think 21st century is witnessing can be a very interesting area of discussion. Maybe we'll come back to some of these issues, but maybe now let me move on to the next presenter. The next presenter was Varuni Madhu Bhashini, who's unfortunately not here. So we'll move on to the last presenter of the session, Mr. Anand Srikumar, who's a research scholar at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And he would be presenting a paper on Gandhi and his links to sentimental cosmopolitan normative theory. So over to you, Anand.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. So I'm Anand Srikumar, and I'm a research scholar at Center for International Politics, Diplomacy and Disarmament at JNU, and I'll be talking on the links of Gandhi with respect to sentimental cosmopolitan normative theory. So fundamentally, before proceeding to what essentially is cosmopolitanism in IR theory, or its predominance in IR theory currently, especially normative theory, I would like to hark upon what cosmopolitanism is as a philosophy in social and political theory in general. So to put it, so while there are different strands of cosmopolitan theory in social and political philosophy, these different themes are united by a single faith in an ethos of shared humanity. So it's basically the conception of a person to think in terms of world citizenship rather than say in terms of narrow territorial affiliations, for example, like a nation state, race, ethnicity, etc. And cosmopolitanism as a theory became especially prominent in IR theory as a result of the end of the Cold War. In the 90s, as we all know, there were a lot of global as well as transnational challenges like terrorism, climate change, and the recent pandemic, etc. So because of the global nature of the problem, there was a global solution that was required. And cosmopolitanism, in terms of a faith in shared humanity, offered precisely that. And so slowly, and there were various other trends. For example, the rise of normative theory instead of empirical theory raised to the forefront. Aesthetic theory, for example, aesthetics and the rise of emotions, and slowly there was a cosmopolitanism emerged as a hegemonic response with regards to normative IR theory. However, there are two fundamental strands of cosmopolitan theory. And one is that of rational cosmopolitanism, which essentially depends on moral rational pronouncements, which shape the foundation of a cosmopolitan world order. And this has been espoused by the likes of Anthony Burke, David Held, etc. And of course, there is sentimental cosmopolitan theory, which foregrounds sentiments as well as emotions. It does not discount reason, but as we argued before in various, as Dr. Amna Mirza pointed out, like focusing on values like compassion, empathy, etc. For example, consider the question of global poverty. If I ask anyone of you, to mitigate global poverty because, we need to rectify problems of global injustice, then I'm appealing to a reason. That is rational cosmopolitanism. But say I show you a picture of a child who is suffering in, say, sub-Saharan Africa, and then you decide to act because I appeal to your emotions, I appeal to your state of compassion, sympathy, etc. Then I'm a sentimental cosmopolitan. So that is a fundamental difference between both of these strands. So how do you link a Gandhian worldview or a Gandhian world order to cosmopolitanism? So such a link is actually hardly novel. There have been multiple writings on the same. For example, there are scholars like R.S. Yadav who have constructed a political Gandhian federation, while there are other scholars like Chandrachud Singh from Ethos, Sean Skarmer from Melbourne, who have argued that Gandhi is more of a rooted cosmopolitan. I do not dispute these claims, but I want to enrich the Gandhian cosmopolitan literature by adding that there is a strong, very prominent sentimental cosmopolitan outlook, which is inherent in Gandhian philosophy. And while there are several notions of Gandhi, for the purpose, because of the time limit, I constrain my operations by illustrating particularly three notions, which are Swaraj, Ahimsa, and Sarvodaya. So what is Swaraj essentially? So a lot of people understand Swaraj mostly in terms of national independence, mostly the independence of India from Britain. And while that is not untrue, it's only a small part of the entire Gandhian worldview of inner Swaraj. So it was only the precursor in order to establish a strong post-colonial cosmopolis, which in the words of Dr. Medha Bisht, was a critical theory in itself. It ultimately would lead to creative forms of human emancipation and challenge the inequalities of the status quo. And so fundamentally, what shapes the relationship among the people within such a post-colonial cosmopolis? It is nothing but ahimsa. So again, there's another misconception of ahimsa as meaning purely non-violence, but again, that's not the case. That's just a small portion. Ahimsa, from the writings of Vidya Chakrabarti, Akhil Bilgrami, is a far more multidimensional concept. It has positive as well as negative connotation. And similar to the positive peace and negative peace and peace studies, this conception as non-violence is merely the negative part of it. Ahimsa is a far more complicated emotion. It's a higher degree of sentiment in which you feel, in which there is absolute non-injury to the body as well as to the mind. So Bilgrami argues that you cannot even criticize your opponent. You cannot even harbor a single ill feeling towards your opponent or your adversary. You can, your ill feeling is towards a deed, not the opponent. And that requires complicated forms of affect, complicated forms of embodiment, fasting, and it's a very highly complicated process. And it goes beyond typical sentimental cosmopolitan images of the West, for example, empathy, compassion, sympathy, etc. This is far rigorous, maybe highly radical form of sentiments which are being expressed through Gandhian thoughts, and it's not being given the scholarly attention that it deserves. So what is the relevance today? So as I argued before, there are global challenges which continue unabated. For example, climate change, the recent IPCC report, the pandemic recently, nuclear proliferation, which continues. So, but in that sense, I echo the sentiments of Dr. Ravan, who spoke before me, in that it echoes the same Buddhist focus on the causal determinants of violence. For example, most of the cosmopolitan solutions, especially rational solutions, focus on global institutions, on macro level, systems level solutions. But Gandhi goes to the micro level, goes to the level of the individual. He tries to prevent chains of violence occurring at the level of the individual itself, at the micro level. And that is based on a belief in the interconnectedness of the world. Maybe there are, instances from Advaita, Vedanta, etc. So in which an individual is connected to the entire universe, to the society, to the community, etc. And that is a radically different way of looking at sentimental cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitanism in general. And of course, as we discussed in depth, there's a strong Euro-American focus of IR normative theory, which is not very different from mainstream IR theory. And there needs to be adequate creative visions from the global south. And definitely, Gandhian thought is definitely a worthy representative in that regard. And finally, the limitations, as we were arguing, as Dr. Medha was saying, so I'm actually working on a paper on Gandhi, on this paper as well as Gandhi nuclear disarmament as part of my thesis. And I had the same issue on approaching Gandhi. So there are a lot of methodological challenges in approaching Gandhi because his texts are scattered across thousands of writings. There's a deep philosophy, but he hardly propounded a systemic philosophy. And so there's a debate of what is Gandhi and what is not. There's a lot of interpretive methods which need to be used. And unfortunately, South Asian IR theory is at its dominant stage. So there are methodological challenges in approaching Gandhi, which need to be discussed in similar forums. And of course, there are disciplinary challenges. For example, Dr. Amna Mirza spoke about the dominance of rationality and various positivist notions, etc., which dominate current IR. And of course, there's a wonderful study by Dr. Richard Jackson of Otago, who has argued that pacifist notions are entirely subjugated in mainstream IR discourse, and you can't, and they need to be desubjugated. Actually, he uses the category of Foucault's subjugated notion, and we need to desubjugate. So obviously, Gandhi, coming from a highly radical pacifist stance, there are disciplinary roadblocks in it when you try to introduce Gandhi into such frameworks. And often, finally, when I went through the brochure of NICE, I was impressed to find that a single line that we should not resort to iconization. And I agree. I mean, unfortunately, there's a tent of, I think one speaker spoke about the Dibyoupadesh. I mean, there's a tent to iconize and there's a tent to mythologize certain conceptions when they are very human. And I think we need to be reflexive in that regard. For example, there is and Gandhi is no different to many others from the South Asia in that regard. And of course, to his politics, there's a racial as well as a caste and a spatial backdrop, slightly hostile to the ideas of equality. And so that is inherent in his worldview. They need to be contextualized, they need to be reflexive. And while we use his ideas in the larger canon of normative theory, we need to be reflexive in, in highlighting these ideological bases. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for finishing right on time. So I think important questions out there, especially I think, Anand, the way you really problematize some of these thinkers and how do we really interpret them. Interestingly, I think we are in a world where we are witnessing very wicked problems and people are coming with notions like, say, cosmopolitan theory or even planetary theory, which I think, the previous speaker sort of referred to, and his thoughts could very well add to that. So I think there is a good challenge here in terms of fitting in non-Western thought, but in what ways to do it? Are we methodologically rigorous? Is this really a balanced approach? For instance, you talked about Gandhi and people have studied Gandhi from various dimensions. For instance, I mean, being a student of IR, I mean, I would see Gandhi is really a grand strategist of thoughts, especially looking at the works of Jean Sharp and, the end goal being very important and how, he balances the means vis-a-vis the ends. But well, I would now move on to the last session of this program. And in this last session, it's primarily, we're focusing on thinkers in particular. So we have three specific speakers. We have Dr. Tamanna, who is an independent researcher. She will be speaking on Krishna and war theory. Interestingly, there has been a lot of work again on decolonizing the notion of war and how does one really understand war primarily from a non-Western lens. So over to you, Dr. Tamanna Khosla. You have 8 minutes for your presentation. Are you there, Dr. Khosla?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, ma'am. And good afternoon, all the co-panelists. I'll just start my presentation in a second. So now, as the title suggests, I'm treating Krishna as a philosopher and not as a person, as a deity. I'm looking at his philosophical basis on which he can be said to be a realist as well as a diplomacy expert. Now, non-violence, many of us have said that, non-violence is extremely important. But for Krishna, it depended on the situation which you were placed. For example, if the need required that you have to take stand against your cousins, then you have to take stand. And I guess in the contemporary times, Krishna's theory can help a lot as far as the diplomacy experts are concerned. Before I start talk about Krishna and the just war, I would like to quote from Jeff McCann's work, where he talks about what is war in Mahabharata. Now, just war, for example, can be looked at as at two bases. Firstly, war stands for conflict between opposing parties. Now, this happened in Mahabharata. In the second, some side may have right to war, whereas others lack justification of war. Those who violate moral considerations fight an unjust war, while those who do not violate moral consideration fight a just war. So this is both the theories are applicable in Mahabharata. Here I look at how just war was defended in Bhagavad Gita by philosopher Krishna, who provided an extended talk on just war and moral theory to his cousin Arjuna on the battlefield. According to Krishna, need for war arises from a breakdown of conventional morality. Gita states that the right side of those whose cause is just has a right to fight, and those who do not, who have unjust, have no such rights. Conventional morality need not be the tool of oppression, but when it is, the alternate is the project of re-establishing a moral order rid of moral parasites. Arjuna, before the war, loses hand and gives three reasons for not fighting the war. Firstly, if he were to fight the war, it would result in death and destruction on both sides, including death of loved ones. Even if he succeeds, there would be no joy because his family would have been decimated. This is the consequentialist argument. Secondly, if the battle is between good and evil, Arjuna's character is not that of an even one like the Kauravas, yet fighting a war would make him no better than his cousins. This is a virtual ethical argument. In Western tradition, virtual ethics is associated with Plato and Aristotle, who did not reason that war was unnecessary, and Plato reasoned that a class of guardians was essential. Thirdly, war results in lawlessness, which undermines the virtue and safety of women and children. It can be understood as Kantian style of ontology. So here I like to move on to what Krishna had to say with regards to his responses for the war. Krishna's argument in Gita that concludes that Arjuna should fight his war and that such a war would be just provided a purely procedural approach to moral theorizing that does not involve or rely upon the good in any deep way. The first procedural ethics he defends is a form of deontology he calls karma yoga, the discipline of action. Action is itself purposeful, and the discipline of action is practice of perfecting purposeful action. The argument is delivered generally as an argument for correct action in the face of uncertainty. So uncertainty is the word. No matter who you are, something counts as your duty, and the perfection of this duty is itself a good that relies one from trouble. Moreover, all people who uphold a transcendental moral order, including Krishna, who is depicted here as the Lord, participate in this moral order by doing their order. The next step is of the Bhakti Yoga. According to this account, the right action is defined by a procedural ideal, unconservatism, and self-governance, and perfecting our practice of right is good. A third moral practice that Krishna recommends is the Gyan Yoga, the discipline of thoughtfulness or knowledge. Gyan Yoga is critical appreciation of framework of moral action, which complements Karma Yoga's disinterest in trying to understand action is justified by outcome. This requires that we follow the dialectics of Krishna, which begins with deontology but ends with recommendation that we do not need to worry about morality, mere devotion to procedural ideal. This seems paradoxical, but the paradox disappears when we appreciate that the moral standards we give up are conventional, tied to the good, and the one we embrace is ideal, tied to the regulative ideal. The argument we find in Gita provides us a way to understand the logic of self-defense. The idea that we have a right to defend ourselves against aggression is widely acknowledged, but for pacifists, it's not so. So, if, for example, if you show one cheek, so and for the Gandhian ideal, for example, who take stand that we should turn the other cheek if let be. But this is not what Krishna's thought is. And yeah, so here I'll just conclude by comparing him to his philosophy to Sun Tzu, while he said that, you know, you should be the preacher should be iron tough. Krishna said that treat everyone as equal. Excessive kindness will beget uselessness, according to Sun Tzu, while Krishna said leaders are compassionate and selfless. Attack, Sun Tzu said attack only when victory is likely. Krishna said attack rather than react. Maneuver to war without a fight. This is what Sun Tzu said. Leaders succeed in excellence by taking action. So I guess that is a whole difference between Western philosophy, Chinese philosophy, and the Indian philosophy. And I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tamanna. I think that was an interesting take, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions on that. In fact, there is a collection of questions right in front of me. But it's interesting that how you bring in Krishna and Sun Tzu together. And, meanwhile, I think when we are really talking about Western intellectual thought, it also really becomes important for us to really look at the philosophical traditions of the time, because the Asian countries, for instance, are very philosophically enriching. And how does that philosophical milieu really informs, I would say, concepts such as war or peace? That becomes really an interesting area to get in. But let me move on now to the next presentation. And the next presentation is on Sun Tzu. So sorry, there are a couple of... just pasting the, so the next presentation is on Sun Tzu, and if you can just introduce yourself, please. I'm sorry, I've lost the page, the schedule. If you can just introduce yourself, and this definitely is going to be a very interesting presentation, because we'll be focusing on Sun Tzu. Over to you.
We also got disconnected with you.
Sorry? Hello? Am I audible?
Ma'am, we'll move to next because he just got disconnected.
He got disconnected. Then I think the last one is Manish. And Manish is again a scholar at the South Asian University. He's a doctoral scholar. Manish is going to look at Confucius, and he's going to offer a Confucius lens in terms of analyzing Chinese strategy. So over to you, Manish.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon, everyone, distinguished chair, distinguished panelists, and all the participants. So I would like to thank and ICE for this giving me this opportunity to speak on this theme. So first of all, let me share the screen. So, online to this theme of the same webinar on bringing indigenous knowledges, experience, and theories to the international relations. So I will be speaking on the Confucian economics and the Belt and its relation to the Belt and Road Initiative. So we particularly know Confucianism on based on the political theory or the theories on humanistic culture. But one of the most under-researched areas of Confucianism is the Confucian economy, which gives us an alternative understanding in analyzing different aspects from China. So particularly here, I am focusing on Belt and Road Initiative. So what makes it and Confucian? What makes the Confucian economics an alternative understanding is that the Chinese massive and rapid economic growth in the few decades has called upon for this alternative understanding, and Confucian economics as Confucian economics, which is also as complete as the theory of liberalism, gives a different paradigm in economics to understand this particular initiative, and and Confucian economics, or let me say President Xi Jinping, who inaugurated this Belt and Road Initiative, has also several quoted Confucius in several speeches while trying to explain this initiative. Thus, so where can we relate this Confucian economics and Belt and Road Initiative is that one of the main aspect of the Confucius economics is the continuity and legacy. It is also dominant in the Confucius political theory and humanistic culture, but here in the economical side, the Confucius mostly focuses on the continuity of the work and continuity of the ancestral work. So we can just relate this aspect to the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation and a revival of the old where it was inspired from where it is the extension of the established, and where this Belt and Road Initiative is the extension of the old Silk Road established by the Han Dynasty 2000 years ago. And another aspect of the Confucian economics is focused on the human nature, especially on the moral economics, or in other words, the familial economics, where the will to live and the worth ethics matters the most, and is focused on equality, and the essence of equality precedes the quality of efficiency. And if we connect this to the BRI and BRI's aim to create connectivity and infrastructure development and promotion of equality, poverty eradication, and fair distribution of resources, then we can just understand how this moral economics come into play while we explain or analyze the fair distribution of resources. And we can also relate this Confucian economics, which is very much equal to socialism, and I say this is the earliest prototype of socialism, the Confucian economics. And the socialism in Confucian economics has all the aspects present in the Confucius values, and mostly this Confucian ideal of grand union, which can be directly linked to the Belt and Road Initiative, creating a grand union, creating and connecting the society, the people. So yeah, so it gives us some clear view that Confucius has been much used can be much used while analyzing this part of Belt and Road Initiative. So if we look at this Confucian economy as a behavioral science, then it is definitely very much important while analyzing the Belt and Road Initiative and other Chinese behaviors in the international system. And moreover, if we look at Confucianism or the Confucian economy and the Belt and Road Initiative, many Xi's quote have come from Confucius classics such as Analects, and not only from the Confucian economy, but also from the different other indigenous scholars like Mencius, Sun Tzu, and many others. And it can also be referred to Taoism as well. So another aspect of the Confucian economy is the inexhaustibility and equal distribution. We can just relate it to the BRI's concept of development is not only the means for creating the infrastructure and connectivity, but it is also about the access to the resources, which gives us a paradigm that the Confucian economy gives us the paradigm that the BRI is on the focus of that the resources are unequally distributed. So there is a need through connectivity that these resources could be equally distributed or fairly distributed. And another aspect is the importance of work, loyalty, and repayment. The value of repayment, which can give a very much of a good understanding of the loan component of the Belt and Road Initiative. No grant but investment. With the no grant but investment aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative, and Belt and Road Initiative, and this Confucius value, Confucian economic value, helps us to understand debt trap, and other loan components of the Belt and Road Initiative. And another aspect of Confucian economy is the family as a principal economic unit. Here, the family doesn't mean the kinship, but it mostly focuses on the continuity, moral and ethical values of filial piety. So, there's no proper. So there's no. When a state joins the Belt and Road Initiative, we can't just many Western scholars have been describing Belt and Road umbrella and etc. Describing it through various kinds, but there is no bond such as kinship bond, but rather the filial piety, the loyalty, the return of loyalty, and be connected to the BRI's and the Chinese support accordingly. So another aspect is about the familial market, but no free market. It focuses especially on the eradication of inequality and again the fair distribution of resources. And another Confucian economic value that is present in the Belt and Road Initiative is the moral cultivation of the power. So the Confucian economy doesn't mostly focuses on the capital formation, but it is very less important compared to the capital formation, but the ethical formation or the moral cultivation is more important. So giving these, looking at these paradigms, we can analyze the Chinese Belt and Road Initiatives, connectivity issues, the development infrastructures, the questions that have been revolving around different aspects. And we can just look at the Chinese, we can, through the Confucian economy aspects or philosophy, we can look at the Belt and Roads Initiative, people-to-people connectivity, or other soft power components regarding this different Confucian economic value. So at last, I would like to also add that not only Confucian economics that is important in understanding the Chinese, understanding China, but it is also important to know the indigenous Chinese strategic texts, differently from Mencius, Dao, or Sun Tzu, and many others. So yeah, I would like to conclude that much, by saying that much. Thank you.
Thank you, Manish. I think for the presentation, it's very interesting that you use this word Confucian economy. I wonder if someone has used it before. But at the same time, you use the word Confucian economy, as you rightly put towards in the last slide, that it's important to really engage and have a broader perspective of Chinese philosophical thinking and how it has evolved over a period of time in terms of really getting some strategic insights. I would say, it could be behind these broader projects such as BRI. But then let's really move on to the last speaker today. And this again is on a Chinese thinker. This is Dr. Gaurav Bhattarai, assistant professor at Tribhuvan University. And he will be talking on Sun Tzu's relevance today and its impact on China's strategies. So over to you, Dr. Bhattarai.
Thank you, Chair, and organizer, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal. So while setting light, my presentation is confined on how really China is winning without fighting. So I'm just going to confine on this dictum, whether China is really winning without fighting by seeking Sun Tzu's relevance in Trans-Himalayan Railway. So my focus will be only on this, like whether Sun Tzu is really relevant in understanding the Trans-Himalayan Railways that aims to connect China with Nepal. I'll start by shedding light on how marginalization and mainstreaming of indigenous theories, because what I assume is that Sun Tzu's theories on war, on statecraft, it's not indigenous. It's not indigenous anymore, as they have been already mainstream in defense studies and they remain no more marginalized. But although for a long time in history, what we see is that Sun Tzu was ignored in Western discourse on realpolitik, warfare, strategic studies, because it's predominantly because of the politics of knowledge production. And secondly, what I assume is that the theoretical dance dismisses the pragmatic reality. What I'm trying to say here is that fitting contemporary cases into different theoretical baskets, and Sun Tzu being one of them, it often misleads the researchers. So thus it's best to, it's always best to highlight on the lived experiences. So owing to the same fact, from the perspective of small countries like Nepal, whether countries are small, big, powerful, powerless, that's another discussion. Let's not move into that. I believe that small is a colonial construct, but because relatively smaller countries. So I think it's best to highlight on the lived experiences, and from the perspective of small countries, China is already winning the war without even fighting it. Because we may be wondering, is like China is really winning the war without fighting? Because BRI as China's new geopolitical strategy, it's already winning the hearts of the small countries in South Asia through aids and investment. And in addition to that, even comprehending debt trap by taking help of Sun Tzu, it's a hamartia. That's a tragic flaw. Because what we see is, even to draw Kishore Mahbubani here, when China prizes freedom, when United States prizes freedom, China values freedom from chaos. Even where we see United States value strategic decisiveness, but China value patience. And today, when United States is becoming a society of lasting inequality, China is a meritocracy. And most interestingly, what I'm trying to emphasize is, while United States abandoned multilateralism, at least during the Trump administration, China welcomed it. So, in addition to that, what we see is that when Trump administration was talking about building walls, China was talking about building bridges. So it seems that China is winning without fighting. So what distinguishes Sun Tzu from Western writers on strategy is the emphasis on the psychological and political elements over the purely military one. So in the South Asian context, if you look at, India's traditional sphere of influence has already encountered an erosion with the what I mean to say is with the increasing presence of China in South Asia. And even in the East Asian context, if you look at, the US influence is limited to diplomatic and strategic engagement. And above all, what we see is President Xi's emphasis on China's interest to avoid Thucydides' trap. It also echoes the Chinese game of Wei Qi, or what we say, Sun Tzu's saying, if you are strong, appear weak. And if you are weak, strong. So, if you are weak, really appear strong. So in the Western concept of chess, the emphasis is on finding the fastest way to capture the king. But in Wei Qi, the goal is to slowly and patiently build up assets to tip the balance of the game in one's favor. So emphasis is on the long-term strategy, not on the short-term gains. So let me narrow down Sun Tzu's dictum of winning without fighting in the context of Nepal, India, China. When the road connecting Kathmandu to China's border was being constructed back in 1960, Chairman Mao had stated, once these roads are open, India may be a bit respectful towards you. Today, what we see is that when Himalayas that are considered as the New Delhi's defense frontier are being penetrated by the connectivity project under BRI, and India has found a refuge in the strategic partnership with the United States that have worsened the great power politics in the region. So, citing Sun Tzu here, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of the 100 battles. But if you know yourself but not the enemy, for even victory gained, you'll also suffer a defeat. So if you know neither the enemy, and even not yourself, you'll of course succumb to every battle. So is Nepal, is in this context, is New Delhi making a fundamental error of perception when it views Nepal-China relation as hostile to India? That's a major research question. Let me repeat that. Is New Delhi making a fundamental error of perception when it views Nepal-China relation as hostile to India? Because India's army chief Narayan's claim at the behest of other, when he was referring to Nepal's protest against India's manservant route, is possibly an apt example to see that. So today, Beijing considers Nepal as a strategic gateway to Inter-South Asia. Although the materialization of Trans-Himalayan Railway that links China with South Asia is still far off. And here, China's consideration, it echoes Sun Tzu saying that when far away, make the enemy believe you are nearby. But when nearby, make the enemy believe you are away. For instance, China has always counseled Nepal to maintain a kind of healthy relation with southern neighbor India, despite of the unconcealed reality that New Delhi wants to, prevent every move made by Kathmandu to creep closer to Beijing. So it is crucially quite a mystery among Nepalese why China provides such a counsel. Even if you look at the Chinese presidency's visit to Nepal in 2019, it was a first visit of Chinese head of state in more than 2 decades that underlines Beijing's growing interest in South Asia as a strategic hub for
1 minute.
And 1 minute. While Bhutan is still not prepared to have a diplomatic relations with China, by coming out of the strategic partnership with India, Beijing perceives 1,415 kilometer Nepal-Tibet border as a source of bridging China and South Asia. So in this context, what I'm just trying to highlight is, despite numerous criticism of Chinese debt trap, environmental issues, and matter of transparency, the materialization of Trans-Himalayan Railway would be a game-changer project in South Asia. But India does not want its traditional sphere of influence to be weakened. So in this context, what we see is that to preserve its prominence in the region, it's always better for New Delhi to find what exactly New Delhi is doing is that finding a kind of refuge in the strategic partnership with United States. So which today it aims to contain China with the debt trap narrative. But let me just finally, what we see is that comprehending debt trap by taking help of Sunju is a hamartia, at least in Nepali context. Because what you see is, let me just give example, of August 2018, when the Department of Railway of Kathmandu, it estimated the cost for the construction of Kathmandu Railway, Kerung Railway, passing through the complex geological terrain, and the cost around 257 billion. So it seems that, while 72 kilometers of railway in Nepal and 98.5% of railway will be either bridges or tunnel. So the project is expected to cost around 3.55 billion per kilometer. It indicates that Nepal government is capable enough to manage the investment amount. So on the backdrop of China-led BRI projects that is facing the debt trap allegation, Nepal finds it's easy in seeking grant for China to build the railway. Beijing, however, has preferred to remain silent over the modality of funding. So in conclusion,
Dr. Bhattarai, yes, you can just wind the argument,
yes,
because
in conclusion, what I'm trying to say is that, in conclusion, India's Himalayan frontier theory is weakened by Trans-Himalayan Railway. There is the increasing, Chinese political presence in Nepal. China's soft power over New Delhi's coercion, you may take of 2016 trade and transit agreement over blockade. Even China wants Nepal to maintain the good relation with India, despite India's, acting on behest of others. While India as a transit state is reluctant to giving an innocent passage to Nepal under United Nations Convention on Law of Sea, Xi Jinping mentioned about upgrading Nepal's status to land-linked country. So while India attempts to privatize Himalayas, China tries to economize. Thus, lastly, what we see is that, finally, I'm concluding, just when India aims to confine Nepal to Indo-centric approach, China has helped Nepal to diversify its relation. Thus, winning the hearts of small state, China has already won the war without even fighting it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We've just been running short of time, and what I really see, we've got a lot of questions, but maybe you'll just give half a minute to 1 minute each. There are 2 specific questions. If Manish and Ambassador Basnyat, if they want, they can address it here, or else maybe type it down. The question to Mr. Basnyat was whether Nepal is adhering to Dibyoupadesh these days. And there's another question to Manish, which says that Confucius philosophy philosophy emphasizes on social relations based on hierarchy, how it could manifest on economic fronts such as BRI. But apart from that, I think there is one interesting question which if any of the panelists are wishing to respond to it. And that question is, what's the scope of indigenous theories shaping the international relations? So over to the speakers now, half a minute, 35 seconds for you to really given the last word.
Thank you, Chair, but I could not exactly grasp the question.
So the question is that, is Dibyoupadesh relevant today in terms of understanding Nepal's contemporary situation?
Yes, it is very, very relevant to our foreign policy. Right now, we have some ingredients of Dibyoupadesh in our foreign policy, and it has also this non-aligned foreign policy, which is actually at that time, non-aligned foreign policy started from 1955, from the Bandung Conference and from Belgrade Conference of 1961. So that was, about 250 years ago. King Prithvi Shah has already, propounded that theory that we should not fight with the big enemies, and we have to be maintaining balance between the two big empires. So that was how he has evolved his theory. So it is a part of Nepal's foreign policy. Until now. Thank you.
So anyone who wants to respond to whether indigenous theories can help shaping international relations? And I think in case this is more of a comment, in case there are no urgent responses, we can then declare this session closed. But yes, over the speakers now, please.
May I address this question?
Yes, Pranata.
I think definitely indigenous theories can be helpful in sorting out present international order related issues. As we already we have discussed Buddha, we have discussed Gandhi, we have discussed, I think there is a whole session on Kautilya. We can see that all these theorists, indigenous theorists, they have touched the issues which are currently very much important. And I think obviously the insights they have shared, it can be used, and it can be useful for human security crisis which we are facing, and the recent world order issues like pandemic situation, like pandemic related cooperative problems, non-governmental agencies, all these can be sorted by indigenous theories. I think there are much scope, but we have to focus on further research because without the proper research in these theories, we cannot, make it useful. So we have to, make a proper research so that we can use and find out way out through these theories. Thank you.
May I answer that question also, madam?
Yes, Ambassador Basnyat.
Yeah, because in international law, there is a theory that there is a customary international law also. So all these indigenous theories have to be accommodated in forming the international law. So contemporary international law, especially Muslim law, have been so many Muslim laws, ingredients have been incorporated in the international law and United Nations documents also. So thank you.
Okay, so thank you. I think, the discussion has not really ended. There are more ideas than responses, than answers. And I'm sure this conversation should go on. But I think on behalf of the panelists who did a brilliant job in terms of covering the thinkers, which I'm sure, we really do injustice to them to club them into 5 to 8 minutes. I'm extremely sorry for that. But I do hope, Dr. Jaiswal, we'll have a much more deliberative session, a much more comprehensive session where we can pick up some of these issues and think of theorizing some of these thinkers and making them relevant to contemporary international relations. So on that note, I would like to declare this session closed. Over to you, Dr. Pramod Jaiswal. or anyone from NICE who can just take in from here, and we can perhaps close this session. No one? And thank you everyone again. And I do hope that we do have another chance for conversing with each other. Thank you very much for your participation. We have another session starting at 4, so please join in there. And I can see Pramod on the screen. Welcome, Pramod. We are done.
Thank you, Medha. Thank you, Medha. Here we come to the end of the first session. We had a very interesting session, and we would like to thank our chair for that and all the speakers as well. Let me move to the second session without any delay. The second session is on Kautilya in international relations. And we'll also be discussing Medha's interesting book, Kautilya's Arthashastra. This session will be chaired by Dr. Namrata Goswami. Dr. Namrata Goswami is the subject matter expert in international affairs with the Futures Laboratory, Alabama, United States of America, and guest lecturer in India Today class, Emory University. She was a research fellow at Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Study Analysis. She was Jennings Rudolph Senior Fellow at the United States Institute of Peace, Fulbright Nehru Senior Fellow, and has participated in George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies, NATO Partnership for Peace Consortium Emerging Security Challenges Working Group. She received the Executive Leadership Certificate from Harvard Kennedy School of Government, National Defense University, and the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. She has published The Naga Ethnic Conflict from a Separate Homeland Stories from the Field, and Great Power Competition in Outer Space is forthcoming. Over to you, Namrata.
Thank you, Pramod, and good afternoon to all. It's early morning here in Montgomery. It's about 5:15, but I'm really excited to be part of the forthcoming panel. So what I was told was that we are going to discuss, of course, Kautilya, but we are also going to see how indigenous experiences, theories, and philosophies actually explain international relations. And in that context, I think before I start the session, I would like to say that there are certain conceptual framing that I think we need to think through as we make our presentations. One of them, I think, is relevant in terms of contemporary international relations as well, and which is the question, how does indigenous concepts and theories inform and explain conceptual ideas? For example, the core ideas in international relations that have been used since the discipline was formulated in the 1940s. One is order. So how is order actually utilized to explain international relations, especially given the fact that it's seen as an anarchic system? That's the first idea. The second idea is that how does international relations explain the concepts of interest and values? So for example, if it is in Nepal's interest to collaborate with, for example, China or India, which international relations theory, especially based on indigenous concepts and ideas, explain that kind of behavior? I think the final thing I would say is that we also need to think about the levels of analysis. So when you're using your concepts, theories, and thinkers from the indigenous setting, first of all, explain what you mean by indigenous. Second, it's very important to explain how those particular indigenous conceptualization explain ideas and phenomenon at different levels. One is the national level. So again, if I take the example of Nepal, which international relations theory from an indigenous perspective explains Nepal's domestic setting, geographic setting, strategic culture? Second, at the regional level, how does Nepal actually behave at the regional level, and which indigenous theory and concept would explain that behavior? And finally, at the international level, where does Nepal see itself at the international level, and why, and which indigenous theory and concept would actually explain that? And I think there is another important idea that we need to think through as we talk about thinkers, especially Kautilya, is which I'm sure Medha would, is the tension between norms in terms of global norms. In fact, even an idea like Kautilya's statecraft, and whether it is implemented at the level of states. For example, in the United States, does Kautilya's idea of the state explain US behavior or Chinese behavior, and whether there is tension in terms of explaining that behavior? So given that, I have been told that each panelist has about 8 minutes and we have an hour. So I would like to first invite Dr. Medha Bisht, who is an assistant professor at South Asian University. Medha, please go ahead.
Thank you, Namrata. So essentially today I will be talking about my recently released book, Kautilya's Arthashastra, Philosophy of Strategy, which Dr. Pramod had told me to speak on. Kautilya's Arthashastra, as we know, is not only an indigenous text, but I think it can also be considered as a non-Western classic. And when I use the term classic, I essentially imply that it has the ability to enthrall minds across generations, and indeed can offer some solutions to address some of the wicked problems that we witness in the 21st century. So we can use interchangeable words, indigenous, native, something which was very specific to Indian culture and Indian philosophical milieu at that point of time. So let me start this presentation by saying that in what ways is Kautilya insightful today? Can it really meet the challenges to respond to some of the wicked questions that I just mentioned? And I think this was essentially the question which was there in my mind when I started writing this book on Kautilya's Arthashastra, Philosophy of Strategy, which indeed was published by Routledge in 2020. And let me add here that while I do not really attend these questions directly, my hope is that the theoretical, the philosophical, and the strategic aspects that I highlighted in the book can perhaps animate one's thinking about these contemporary issues. And maybe perhaps in the next 8-minute window that I have been given, let me highlight some of the main arguments in terms of flagging of some of these concerns which I've raised. Now, one of the main arguments that I offer in this book is that understanding different ways of thinking is important because they are a product of a different, distinct cosmovision. Now, in Arthashastra, this cosmovision was reflected through the articulation of dharma, which I interpret as order. And this understanding of order indeed helps us to get a perspective on concepts such as state, power, morality, justice, etc., as used in Arthashastra, as they were employed, at that point of time. Thus, any modern interpretation of the text, I think, needs to be mindful of this fact. Let me also add here that this understanding of order, which was anchored to dharma in Hindu philosophy, was not equated with a theocratic framework, but understood more as a way of life, which became the normative guide for the king and the subjects in political and social affairs. So in the idyllic state of Kautilya, I would say dharma thus became a reflective basis for knowing, understanding, and judging the phenomena outside. Now, significantly, if you look at the etymological roots of dharma, it is interestingly informed by the word dhra, which forms words like dhairya, which means endurance, dharti or dharti, which is earth, and which I think, is suggestive of something which can hold things together and possess the capacity to endure despite challenges. Thus, as we read the text, we find that dharma became central to the understanding of social and political order, giving meaning to terms like power, order, morality, justice, state, etc., as I just mentioned. And duties were emphasized more than rights. And more importantly, only when the ruler delivered on his duties did he have the authority or he earned the deserved right or the adhikar to rule. Now, duties of the ruler in this regard were raksha, which is protection of state from external aggression, palan, maintenance of law and order, primarily related to internal aspects, and yogashema, which is safeguarding the welfare of the people. So it's important to note here that these duties in many ways did not differentiate between human and the non-human, and I think that's important. Steps were taken to minimize threats from the human realm, that is warfare and internal rebellion, which of course we talk about, but also non-human, like natural disasters and preservation of flora and fauna. So doing so ensured, I would say, again, the existence of the state, which itself, again, was not just the embodiment and agency of dharma, but a human artifact, as someone has called it, to get the human race out of human nature. So as students of international relations, I think we need to keep in mind this interaction between philosophy, concepts, and practice in Arthashastra. And the ways in which they really address questions which in fact are considered political, because essentially we're talking about a pre-Westphalian period here. So overall, there are two arguments in the book that I offer. The first is that the notion of order is central to the understanding of Arthashastra. The notion of order here was anchored to the concept of dharma. And second, Kautilyan strategy is a web-based strategy. It is a network-based understanding where the notion of relatedness informed how governance, that is Rajaniti, and strategy, that is Kootaniti, needed to be perceived. And I developed these three arguments in three distinct sections of my book. So in the first section, I've highlighted epistemic practices, ways of thinking which I think are important, which govern the text. This helped me to understand the larger question of dharma and how it reconciled the philosophic and the strategic thinking. This way of thinking, or the distinct epistemic practices that Arthashastra offers, become clearer through the employment of Anuvikshiki, which is defined as the methodology in Arthashastra as mentioned in book 15, titled as the methods of science. Anuvikshiki is important because it was one of the four types of vidyas, that is knowledge, that Arthashastra emphasized upon. The other three being the Vedas, the religious stance, the Varta, which was the economics, and the Dandaniti, which was political science. Anuvikshiki means investigation. It was also termed as a lamp of all sciences. And Arthashastra, in fact, further emphasizes that only, and this is important, only by the means of Anuvikshiki will we know what is good and evil in Vedic lore, material gain and loss in economics, good policy and weak policy in science of politics. So I consider this very important because Anuvikshiki is a meta-theoretical lens to organize knowledge. It's not telling us about a theory, but it's really about the act of theorizing itself. When Arthashastra notes that Samkhya, Yoga, and Lokaya constitute Anuvikshiki, it is in a way suggestive of embracing contradictory systems of thought of Indian philosophy. So what we see through this is a sort of dialectics between both positivist, which I would say is the Charavak or / the materialist tradition, or the reflectivist, which is the Samkhya and the Yoga tradition. Now, an extrapolation that one can make from this interpretation is that Kautilya's Arthashastra, which where we consider entities as states, here the entities are not given. They evolve organically. And the character of the entity, that is the state, can be influenced by its dominant features, that is the Prakritis. It is for this reason that Arthashastra puts an emphasis on excellencies, outstanding characteristics of each of the constituent elements, which can determine the identity of a state as a superior state and an inferior state. And I would say that these 7 but distinct elements are also indicative of a plural understanding of power, where moral power, Swami, intellectual power, Amatya, legitimate authority, Janpad, defensive power, Durga, economic power, Kosha, offensive power, Danda, and relative power, Mitra, become important. Now, in the second part, what I essentially did was that I explored the relationship between feasible and desirable elements. Here, I've looked into the macro and the micro narratives, which are often braided in Indian classical thought. Now, these interrelationships, to my mind, become important because they give a distinct meaning to concepts which we often use in international relations. Thus, I examined the meaning of 3 different concepts, morality, order, and power, as used in Arthashastra, and how a relativist meaning emerges when we anchor them to the cosmic vision of dharma. Thus, what comes out from this part is that concepts such as power, morality, and order in Arthashastra are used in a relational manner, which means that they were directed towards achieving a particular end goal, which was Yogashema, ensuring the security and well-being of the people. This purpose of state, thus the purpose of state was the key element in shaping, directing, and even balancing order, both at the domestic and the internal level, the internal and the external level. So the state and the statecraft need to be seen in a continuum, right? Now, in the third part, I've established a conversation between concepts and vocabularies we often use in IR. And here I argue that concepts in IR are not value neutral. as they stem from distinct geocultural spaces, given the distinct cosmic visions, and perhaps that's why we call them indigenous, native, etc., etc. Now, here I argue that one should not go beyond binaries of Western and non-Western, as ideas migrate and evolve, having a meaning of their own in different cultures. What I'm emphasizing here is that one needs to understand that there is a different way of thinking, a different cosmovision to look at the world. And what we need to do is to establish perhaps a conversation between different cosmological assumptions and the emerging debates around the philosophy of science and international relations per se. And this demands that we take both the geography of ideas and the history of ideas seriously and see how they can contribute towards making the global, making of global and international relations. Beyond this theoretical philosophical purpose, I think indigenous thought can also be employed to understand how certain choices can be made in strategy. What are the different genres of stratagems, and why is a grand strategic design important to bridge the gap between the desirable and the feasible, to bridge the gap between the micro and the macro, and also the gap between the philosophical and the political. So is my time over, or do I have some more time, Namrata? You are on mute, Namrata.
I said you have about a minute to wrap up.
Okay. So I would say that I would just like to conclude by saying that for me, one of the most important takeaways from Arthashastra is that it focuses on studying relations and urges us to stay attentive to practices, values, preferences, which can be analyzed by understanding interactions, relations, practices, and the larger cosmic vision that we anchor to. This was reflected in ancient India, where dharma became a fluid interlocutor of sorts to give meaning to power, order, morality. Second, it is also suggestive of the fact that one should go beyond fixed attributes of separatedness, of seeing the world in terms of substances and things, but rather have a more networked, interrelated, or a web-based understanding of the world. And I think some of the non-traditional challenges which we are witnessing today just demand such kind of an approach. And I'm sure revisiting a classic, should be undertaken with this perspective, because classics, after all, are open-ended. Then only through interpretation or reinterpretation, they evolve really as a classic per se. So thank you, Chair. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Medha Bisht. I think there are certain interesting ideas that came to my mind as you were speaking. One is that what I found insightful is that, especially coming out of Kautilya's Arthashastra, is that I thought what you mentioned in terms of the different ideas of power itself, in terms of how power is seen. It's not just about military power, for example. You also have value-based power, which I think connects to your idea of what is the end goal of the state, in which, in your perspective, if you look at Kautilya, the end goal of the state is the well-being of the people, right? So which brings me to an interesting concept of international relations, which is legitimacy. So what I get from your description of Kautilya's Arthashastra is that Kautilya actually cared a lot about the legitimacy of the ruler. And you could see that in his entire endeavor of how he wrote the book, that unlike the Western understanding that Kautilya is a realist construct, which looks at the interest of the ruler itself, what you have very convincingly argued is that it's much more than that. It's actually a larger comprehensive philosophical text. So thank you for that. We'll come back. I have a few questions for you, but we can take that in the end. Let's move on to Dr. Anna Nath Ganguly, who is an assistant professor at Amity University. Dr. Ganguly, you have about 8 minutes. Take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Namrata, and thank you to our chair in the first session, and also here, Dr. Medha, because I think Dr. Medha has beautifully summarized on all the points. And my other panelists would also touch upon aspects of power, Saptanga theory, and Niti Shastra. So I do not want to go with those explanation of those things. But what Dr. Namrata has left with the last thing is that legitimacy, what Kautilya emphasizes on, is where he talks about the idea of justice. I mean, where it is always mentioned in his book that if the sovereign is not able to deliver justice, and justice is not a modern concept for a country like India, because justice is a very ancient concept, and the access to justice has been also a very old concept, which is very ancient and very historic to countries in South Asia and India. So this aspect of access to justice and legitimacy is what makes a sovereign more powerful. And the entire my presentation is about the scientific outlook of Kautilya's approach, and where I have very romanticism, combine the idea of artha and dharma, which is entirely what Kautilya's Artha Shastra is all about. There is a combination of always trying to emphasize on both power and both, which is artha, the wealth, and then the dharma, which is about the ideal. So dharma has multiple meanings, and Dr. Medha has rightly pointed out in the previous session also, we have been seeing a lot of things. But when I see Kautilya, when I read Kautilya, we are all infused with this two assimilation of artha and dharma, and which basically leads me to the fact that with Kautilya was a realist and Kautilya was a very spiritualist or an idealist. And we see a combination of Kautilya's Arthashastra book highlighting on 2 points of both material and metaphysical aspects of power. Because when you're looking at Kautilya's Arthashastra and you're studying Kautilya's Arthashastra in detail and reading it, you'll see the fact of the outlook that he presents are kind of layered into the actual, the possible, and the potential. So I see that what he actually determined of how power was. And at the time, the subcontinent was entirely divided. And so at the time, the context of power and the kind of assessment of the needs of a nation were also different. But we can later in my discussion, I'll just connect that how in the contemporary times this is relevant. But 3 things that I emphasize on is the actual, the possible part of it, and the potential, what Kautilya basically wrote in his entire book. Now, when I also look at Kautilya, a lot of things have been reiterated again and again, but certain things is that how he works on his entire foreign policy, on how to deal with nations. But I also read there are parts in Kautilya's Arthashastra that talks about not only dealing with nations, that is where the mandala theory and Raj Mandala and everything has emerged, but also about how you deal with the nationals, you deal with your neighboring countries, and you also, is there any kind of dharma in such kind of behavioral aspects. Now, this is the scientific approach, though there is a lot of science of administration in Kautilya, which we put it for internal politics, but there is a lot of science and mapping and measuring by Kautilya in terms of foreign relations. And we do know about mandala theory, Raj Mandala, circle of states, we know about the tactics, but there are certain things that Kautilya also works out in terms of nation, security, and peace. So the peace process, internally we know as, Sam, Dan, Dhan, the Bhed, but externally also he applied the same 4-fold pillars, and he looked at how you deal with, you compare power and how you deal with nations and how you deal with nationals. So as we look at countries and we measure them by Kautilya's scientific approach, we see whether we are able to scientifically comprehend that who are our enemies and who are our friends. Are we missing out on not mapping that who are our allies and potential allies? So this is where India at this point is also confused, I guess, a little bit, and many South Asian countries are also confused about how do we measure and scientifically reach out or scientifically measure the allies and enemies and friends. There are a few things that Kautilya really highlights is that politics is not an independent entirely entity. Politics is always subordinate to ethics, and this we all know. But the point is that when we apply politics in practice, we often forget about the dharmic values. There are 2 things of dharma which we know. Dharma as an ideal, which is a sense of duty that both the sovereign king and the people of the territory should apply. But there is another thing of dharma, which is about rules of justice or rule of law. In today's contemporary world, what we are seeing is that rules-based approach is compromised by every nations, because it is about nations' own interest that is subordinating rules of law, but Kautilya has often highlighted the rule of law is a very important matter when you're dealing in foreign relations. And you can see that that is where international law, that is where human rights law is all, determining its entire approach to the global issues. And as Dr. Medha has also pointed out very nicely, and which is known to all of us again, is that the cosmic law, we are all part of cosmic law. Nations are also part of cosmic nature and cosmic law. The part of politics is a part of cosmic law. And in this, do we as nations today basically understand Kautilya when he emphasizes on the cosmic part of our integration to the whole universal concept? Today we are colonizing the space. Today we are degrading the environment. Today we are actually dehumanizing rights and natural essence of humanity. Today we are basically sacrificing the nature. And Kautilya, a book which actually came out, decades before and actually was discovered much later, was still much more, you can say, a classic which came out much more before the Western classics have come out, in order to highlight all these issues of politics as part of cosmic law, as politics as part of also following rule of law, politics as also looking at access to justice. And so when I look at Kautilya, I always try to understand that though it's always said that he's a realist thinker, but I think there is a lot of idealism. Of course, he's ingrained, or if you can say that he has brought in together strategy, treachery, and he has also brought in dharma, which is morals. But as you have seen that while what Kautilya has taught later disappeared from the Mauryan Empire because of Buddhas and the focus of dharmic law. But I basically would like to focus that artha and dharma are the two very essence of foreign policy. If you are a nation who is trying to be powerful and you're not trying to be a hegemon but powerful, both artha and dharma has to go together. And all this artha and dharma does not base on coercion but collaboration. And that is what today we are doing in a globalized setup of collaborative practices. So I think I'll not take much time, but later if I'm left with time, then Dr. Namrata can tell me. I can just put in one word, and if not, then I'll just stop it right here.
Yeah, you could take a half a minute and summarize.
Okay, so the last point that I would just like to highlight, because not much work is done on this, but I think there are pointers in Kautilya's Arthashastra, is about how do you treat prisoners and how do you treat actually nationals of other countries, because Kautilya says you are a conqueror state, right? But does the conqueror state undermine while it protects the interests of its own national, does it undermine the protection and security for other nationals? I don't think so, because there are lines in the fact of Kautilya's book that says that, when you have a king, when you conquer a state and there is a king and there is a heir to a good throne, then you free the prisoners. But not much has been detailed in the book. But we would definitely like to work in future on this aspect, because today we are dealing with such kind of context. Thank you so much, Dr. Namrata, for the time that you have given. We'll take questions later. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Ganguly. I thought what I found insightful, excellent presentation. I thought you brought in the interesting tension that Kautilya actually reflects on, which is the tension about justice and legitimacy, and also the how do you then operationalize concepts like deception or treachery, right? Which is also a part of how a state needs to behave. I think what I find insightful from your presentation is that, and what I thought I understood is that for Kautilya, what mattered was that how does his theorizing in terms of state behavior lead to the enhancement of the state, but not just in terms of power, but also in terms of what value it brings, right? And so let's have a discussion again once everybody gets a chance, but thank you for that. Next, we have Dr. Nanda Kishore, who's Associate Professor at Manipal Academy of Higher Education. Is Dr. Kishore here? Pramod, is Dr. Kishore available?
Let me check. Yes, I have to make him co-host. Now he can unmute.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Please go ahead. You have 8 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just share the screen, probably that's much easier, and I'll just go by. my presentation. So it's on the comprehensive national power and Saptanga of Kautilya. I'm not dealing with any of those issues that are associated with dharma and other things because the other scholars have already covered. So I would not be looking at, is my screen visible to all of you?
Yes, it's visible. Please go ahead.
It's also in full screen or?
Yeah, it's in full screen now. So you're perfect.
Okay, yeah. So I'm not dealing with any of those issues because dharma itself will take a lot of time with the paucity of time. I'll just directly move into understanding comprehensive national power. This is something that's been spoken for quite some time now. First and foremost is Kautilya doesn't use the terminology state or any of these things. I've debated even before on many of these thoughts when we say, for any of the concepts for that matter, when we say the principles of state or the objects of state or anything that's we use the word state, it's more Western driven because the idea of the state itself is from there. That's not the thought at all in Kautilya's Arthashastra itself. Now, this is something that got popularized, the idea of comprehensive national power in the 20th century, which I mentioned here. Deng Xiaoping actually putting an emphasis on that one in measuring a country's national power. One must also look at it more comprehensively rather than on any one part of it. It's an organic sum of the different parts of a sovereign state during a given period of time. It's also loaded with formulas and mathematical models and many other things which have made it comparatively redundant in times to come. But unfortunately, there's not enough clarity on that one. There is much more emphasis on the economic side of it. That's a problem because there is no philosophical foundation embedded in morality and ethics as the base of assessing oneself. And why the growth? This is where Kautilya comes in because his opening remarks are about that one, about the king and then the way the state has to be held, how the subjects have to conduct themselves. In each of those, dharma is the basis of everything. So the modern idea of projecting him is one-sided, where he's called as a realist, where he's called as somebody who's crooked or skewed way of looking at national security. Many of those things are absolutely different sort of components that we look at here. Now, Kautilya has a basis when he discusses elements of an entity. That's what I'm using the word entity, not using the state at all. Had Kautilya spoken about any specific one state, either of Magadha or Gandhara or any of those things, he would have not been relevant today at all. That's precisely why he hasn't made any of such statements, nor he has used the word state at all, because neither the king nor the state for him mattered so much because he doesn't want to use some of those terminologies, though we see somewhere modern usage of the term even sovereign, which the king was not. That's precisely, you see, he speaks about the treatise has been composed by one who resenting Nanda and all the things he mentions, just talking about the different components that we look at, dharma, artha, kama, and the moksha that we are trying to look at, the good versus the evil and many other components that are regularly discussed with regard to him. This is how the Saptanga looks at, though there is no word called Saptanga in the Arthashastra. When we read, it only says that iti prakrityaha. Prakrityaha, when it says, it means nature. It also can be the elements. That's what we can talk about, but there are no specific mention of the word Saptanga because they contain 7 elements or 7 different components, we tend to call them, which leads into Swamin, Amatya, Rashtra, Kosha, Durga, Danda, Bala, and the Mitra. Mitra is the contribution or the biggest contribution by Kautilya, because prior to him, there were 24 different Arthashastra that were there, which is a clear mention, which has been mentioned by Kautilya himself. Without wasting much time, we look at what exactly he's trying to talk about when he says this component here. When he says that a wise king can make the poor and the miserable elements of a sovereignty happy and prosperous, but a wicked king will surely destroy the most prosperous and loyal elements of his kingdom. This is what he talks about Swamin. For him, Swamin is the one who has to lead from the front, who has to know to differentiate between good and the bad. For him, that's exactly what is required. For that, there is a training. There are a lot of things that he talks about. So anybody and everybody, just as a fortune, cannot come and sit there. So in the modern terminology, it is also about a legacy that one has to come with. That means at least an experience, not about speaking about the familial legacy, but an experience that one has to come, a training somebody has to go through, which is a rarity in the modern polity that we are able to see here. Now, the relation between king and the people is expected to be that of father and the child. Now, Kautilya expected the king to be generous to the subjects, and their Yogakshema. Yogakshema is what we call in the modern terminology as welfare. Now, Amatya is the second unit where loyalty, nativity, and the logical ability as one of the prime criteria for appointing someone as a counselor, which we can look at in modern terminology as the council of ministers. Though these people are equally important to aid the king. Otherwise, the Swamin cannot exist. We'll come back to some of those components in a minute or two. The person should not be arrogant and should not be erratic in his approach and behavior. Probably today, looking at the way the Indian Parliament is being conducted, perhaps Kautilya would have committed suicide. Is the screen moving?
No, it's not moving right now.
Okay, yeah, the Kosha is the third model that's called as where we look at economics in the modern terminology, where we remember that the Chinese model was about white cat or black cat, but whereas in Kautilya's case, Dharma comes first even before the acquisition of wealth. In Arthashastra, he makes a mention that the wealth of the state shall be acquired lawfully either by inheritance or by the king's own efforts. It shall consist of gold, silver, precious gems, and gold coins. It should be large enough to enable the country to withstand a calamity, even of long duration, during which there is no income. This is how he talks about. When then there is a place where there is this very interesting debate between him and Kaunapadanta. Means he himself talks about the one who have written before, where Kaunapadanta says, as one of the scholars, he says calamity to the army is more damaging than that of the treasury. Kautilya says no, fears that without finances and proper payment, the soldiers may rebel and even go to an extent of killing the king himself. So we look at how we need to keep them happy. The next component is Danda, where the army shall consist mostly of men of tested loyalty, Kshatriyas, having come down from the king's father and grandfather. The soldiers should be strong, obedient, not averse to a long expedition, with powers of endurance, skills of handling. He talks about all these things where this part might be comparatively irrelevant because you don't really see only one section of the society working. These were the times where things were based on the Varnas, and then he has spoken about. But nevertheless, the value that he adds up to is what the essence is what we need to understand. That means the strong, obedient, and not averse to a long expedition, with powers of endurance, skills in handling all weapons, and experience of many battles. That part we need to hold on to, because there are a lot of other things that we may find, because if something has been written so long and it's yet relevant, because we write a constitution in 1949 and adapted in 1950, and it has gone through more than 120 or 130 odd amendments. That itself we need to understand how important it is, or how great a work this one is. Mitra is, as I told you, the greatest contribution of Kautilya compared to all his predecessors, the 24 that he mentions about. Perhaps this concept of Kautilya has become the most important in international politics in the last 150 to 200 years, with the balance of power to all sorts of things that we're talking about. Because here he says, the ideal ally is the one who has the following qualities. He says, a friend of the family for a long time, constant, amenable to control, powerful in his support, sharing a common interest, able to mobilize the forces quickly, and not a man who double crosses. That means his friends. This is what he talks about. But then he problematizes each of these things. A good friend who's there with you for a long time but is not capable, is he the friend you are trying to look at as Mitra? Or he says somebody who's long-standing unsubmissive friend, or a temporary submissive friend. He asks these questions also. Then he talks about two submissive friends who are long-standing friends with limited prospect than that of a temporary friend. So he himself problematizes. This is, I think, the beauty of the contribution of some of these classics, is that they themselves put those questions, not the reader essentially getting it. And this is the dialogic subject that we see in Kautilya's Arthashastra. Again, this comes equally from the Vedas itself, where there are question and answers which are constantly there. I think that's the engagement rather than a monologue that he tries to engage us with. Now, the CNP is essentially expected to lead to an assessment, what we call as the power assessment, wherein the realistic understanding of power, then formulating firm policy, can happen through three types of Shaktis that he talks about: Utsaha Shakti, Prabhava Shakti, and the Mantra Shakti. Do I have a minute or so?
Yes, just could you wrap up in a minute? Thank
yes.
you.
So now Utsaha Shakti stands for the energy, bravery, and the personal drive of the king himself. where Prabhava Shakti refers to material resources, including the treasury and the army. The Mantra Shakti means good counsel and diplomacy. Now, Kautilya is of the view that the Mantra Shakti is the most important of all three, because once that is there, the rest of them will follow. I'll move into conclusion, where I'm trying to look at the comprehensive national power in one of the best ways to assess a state's position in the world order, given the importance of it in the present times. Now, reading the text right is equally important than trying to find utility in everything to make it contemporary. That's my submission here. One also needs to keep in mind the discriminatory knowledge, or the Matsya Kshira Nyaya, that Kautilya talks about in reading and adopting Kautilya, as many things might not be fully suitable now. There are limitations to, as I mentioned, the redundancy of the text in many occasions can be a limitation, but there is something called as the heart and soul of a particular text that's still relevant. Now, seeing it as a rich heritage and a heuristic work would probably enhance its importance itself. So going back to, just to conclude, it can be the other way around. You can have good friends, and then you can, from them, you can be confident of raising a good army, or with their help, you can still manage with a limited army. For that, you require good infrastructure to manage them. For them, you can, for that to happen, you should have a good economy. And for that economy, you need to have people, not just in number, those who can really contribute as Janapada Rashtra that we talk about. For all these things to happen, you require a set of people who can aid the Swamin in the best possible manner. Either we can start from Swamin and end at Mitra, but we can also start from Swamin and go the other way around. I think that's the beauty in when he says Iti Prakrityaha. With that, I'll probably conclude. Look forward to certain questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kishore. I thought when you pointed out that there are certain concepts that we use, for example, the state as we understand in the modern context, Kautilya might not have meant it that way, and that I thought was an interesting insight. What I found useful was that, at least if we think of it from the contemporary context, is that if you look at what you describe, for example, the different variants of power, or the different variants or elements of a state, which probably is a better word, you could actually use that to explain how states are today, or how a particular state behaves, no matter what the different domestic setting might be in terms of foreign policy, or in terms of how it looks internally. And finally, I thought that was a very important insight, that Kautilya himself had dealt with contradictory ideas, like a dialogue, right? And so thank you for that.
Thank you.
The next presenter is Ashtha Chadha. Are you there?
Yes. Hello.
All right. Please go ahead and make your presentation. You have 8 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Astha Chadha. I am a PhD student at Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University, Japan, and a researcher at Center for Democracy Promotion. So I'll begin my presentation. Just a minute. I think my screen is visible now. All right. So my presentation is about Niti Shastra before Kautilya. And I'll try to move towards a non-Western IR theory and address the subject as a whole. I won't go into specifics because all the speakers before me have done an excellent job at that already. I'll just move to my main ideas. So the idea is, why do we need a non-Western IR theory? And there have been several arguments in the past by the scholars of non-Western IR in itself. They say the Western IR is too narrow in its sources and too dominant already. It is said that realism's role in reaffirming Western hegemony is basically done by taking political system which the West imposed on other nations and then made it a universal norm, which is not true. And then another argument that's given is that, as addressed by the previous speaker also, that the very problem with the definition of the state, because Europe's political remaking and redefining of its colonies, it was basically trying to create its own image and see the sovereign territorial states, the diplomacy and international law in the way Europe defined it. So we do have non-Western IR thinkers, but where is the theory? So it is done in two major ways in the academia. One is either there is an explanation of past events, and those are explained by some native indigenous justifications, by some theories, and Kautilya is just one of them. Or it is done by individual political thinkers that exist in Asia or in Africa or in the Middle East, and trying to bridge, some understandings that exist in the Western IR with the thought process of these individual political thinkers. So, but that leaves us with some questions. For example, what explains nuclear weapons procurement in South Asia? Is that a question that the Western IR is not able to answer? Do we need a non-Western IR theory to answer questions like, is non-alignment an indigenous theory at all? Or is it about being a neutral, which can be explained in some aspects by the Western IR theory? So I'm arguing that we need basically a continuous and coherent narrative of Indian IR thought. And by Indian here, I mean, it's just an example. It could be African or Middle Eastern, but since I'm dealing with Kautilya, hence we need a continuous coherent narrative of the Indian IR thought that explains the Indian worldview if we are to move towards a non-Western IR theory. So before Kautilya, I just take one example of Vidur Niti, which is basically taken from the Udyog Parv of Mahabharata, the great epic. And Vidur is the prime minister as well as the brother of the king Dhritarashtra. And I won't go into specifics, but the idea is that in Vidur Niti, which is composed of 8 chapters and over 500 verses, there are certain similarities with what Kautilya says later on, and Mahabharata, as we know, was much, much before Kautilya. So he talks about state enemies, state allies, friends, who should be your enemies, how to deal with them, who should be your allies. There's a detailed discussion on Vidur advising the king about dharma, artha, kama, and how dharma and artha are extremely important for the kingdom. He talks about duties of a king and how to maintain a very prosperous state. So there's this idea of comprehensive development, which is not only...
Just a minute. I think somebody is not muted. Please kindly, could everybody mute their microphone except Ms. Chadda? It's disturbing her presentation. Thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Chadda.
Thank you so much, Ms. Namrata. So the idea is that Vidur asks, why is strategy so important? And he gives an answer which is very much similar to what Kautilya gave, many centuries later. He says, an arrow unleashed by an archer may kill a single man or not kill anyone, but a strategy unleashed by a wise man kills even those still in the womb or brings ruin to the entire state. So his idea is that the need for a ruler is to wield danda, which is the punishment, and ensure dharma, to avoid Matsya Nyaya. And I think these concepts, people who are familiar with Kautilya Artha Shastra would already know. So let me move to the next slide. This is just one example of the policy tools that Vidur explains. And he's saying there has to be a discrimination of the two by means of one. I mean, as you can read on the slide, the idea is that he's providing 4 policy options: Samadana, Danda, Bheda, which is punishment, sowing dissension, rivalry, reconciliation. He's talking about 3 key entities apart from the state, which is the enemy state, the ally state, or the neuter state. And then he's talking about 6 policy options which are there in front of the king, the upayas, or as Kautilya calls it otherwise, which is peace pact, initiating hostilities, remaining stationary, marching into a battle, or being offensive, and seeking refuge, or double stratagem. So my idea is to say that these ideas that Kautilya presented in his work are not just coming out of a vacuum. As he notes in the initial shloka of his work, they are a continuous Vedic thought on the treatise on politics in the Indian political thought. So there are certain debates within the indigenous IR, and these are the debates that even Vidur in Mahabharata has addressed. For instance, policy options against the enemy: should you be forgiving or should you have an offensive action? Then there's this discussion about dharma, artha, danda, and I mentioned that before. Then there's this idea of what sort of progress leads to prosperity and which progress should be avoided if it leads to destruction in the larger picture. So I mean, those are the debates that Vidur also engages in. Now, there are certain challenges to Kautilya thought, and which are criticisms of Kautilya in general, but the idea is that there are criticisms presented in the general Vedic or the Indian IR thought. One is that it is said that they are very time bound and they are limited in their applicability. However, I would disagree and say that the Dharmic worldview is not pure realist or pure expansionist. It's much more, and I think Dr. Medha had already talked about this in certain aspects. The other argument is that Artha Shastra of Kautilya, or you could talk about Vidur Niti, it draws from a collective wisdom of Vedic tradition, which is continuous. To say that it was discovered suddenly in 1900s, rediscovered in 1900s, and hence there was a break in the political thought would be incorrect. And the reason being that all these ideas are not just emerging out of Kautilya, they have been there present in the Vedas and then found their place into Ramayana, into Mahabharata, and so many other texts. The other argument given against such a non-indigenous IR is, against the indigenous IR is that these texts were forgotten, and to follow these texts or to say that they are very relevant today is to prove that a nation is stuck in the past. But the problem here with this kind of criticism is that Kautilya is a tradition. He is not just one author. He himself represents a whole tradition, a whole world view of how states or how nation states or how a king should be ruling his people, how he should behave with his enemies, what are his policy options. And it is a very anachronic argument if they say that a nation is stuck in the past, because it assumes that any sort of strategic thought or any pragmatism is only a recent global phenomena, which is, as we saw, not true. So there are some challenges if we are to create an IR theory. One is the problem of false equivalences and conceptual confusions. The first one, dharma and religion are equated, which is not true at all, because religion is more about a divine law which is dictated. However, the Indian thought is more about seeking. No, there is no God dictating anything. It is about seeking and spirituality, and clubbed with pragmatism and rationalism. So then the other problem is with the varna and caste. I think one of the previous speakers also articulated something similar. Varna is the system of dividing the society according to the professions. Caste, on the other hand, is not even an Indian concept. It comes from Europe. It is a Spanish word called casta. Hence, it was superimposed by the British on the Indian society, and it does not really find any any mention in any of our texts. Then, of course, there are other false equivalences, such as equating monarchy with despotism, or calling epics as myth instead of itihasa, which is history. And then, of course, there's an overall Oriental view of our texts. And that is one reason why it is difficult to formulate them into a comprehensive IR theory. So to conclude, I think what the academia would try to do is to find a space for non-Western IR within the present IR. The idea is not to completely reject the current or the present Western IR theory or the IR theory in general. The idea is to explain what has not yet been explained by the Western IR because of the difference in frameworks, the difference in the whole worldview. What we need to encourage is an alternate IR thinking by being able to balance both indigenization as well as the modern political thought. So here are some examples where, how the Indian IR could contribute to the present IR theory. One is that since it is so truly inclusive and looks at a very holistic view of development, it does not really need to be trapped between the dualism of self and other, which the Western IR sometimes tends to get trapped in. The second is the idea that dharma, which is the order or the law of the time, is not fixed according to the Indian political thought. So there is no fixed identity, there is no fixed rule. It keeps changing. Every era, every yug has its own different characteristics. Hence, the dharma is distinct as well. The third is that Vidur's Niti Shastra as well as Kautilya talk about human security-centered development approach, which is very important.
Could you please wrap up since we have some time for questions? Thank you.
And just to mention a last point, the idea is that, of course, Huntington mentioned a clash of civilizations, but these texts obviously question whether civilizations necessarily need to clash. Can there not be holistic development among all the nations, moving towards the collective good? And of course, in the end, there has to be a formulation of non-rigid identity of nations, and that would have far-bearing implications on the IR as a field in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chadda. Very interesting presentation, especially I think the one important point that you raised, and I thought that was interesting, was that if you look at the text, certain concepts, for example, caste is not mentioned, right? And so then we need to think, why was it not mentioned? Because caste was an important phenomenon in society at that time. What was Kautilya's idea of that? And why did he not really mention that? Is it because he thought that was not relevant? I think the second interesting insight that I think is important is that your point that sometimes, of course, there is this general understanding that dharma is equated with religion, right? And I think that was a very important point, that it's actually much more. And it's actually a different conception of order, which is not really just, you cannot just limit it to religious understanding. Well, let me open up the floor for questions. I think there is a question which I think almost all the panelists can answer in a minute, because I want to take a few more questions. We have about 7-8 minutes for questions. So one question is, how can you use, this question is from Tikej, I think, and he says, how Kautilya's strategies and wisdom could respond for Nepali strategists to maintain growing regional and global power. For example, how can Kautilya's text help Nepal formulate its grand strategy? Medha, would you like to go first? Especially in the context where it has to navigate a region where you have great powers like China, India, and the US jostling for influence. So how would a small state like Nepal, which has power projection capability, utilize Kautilya's text?
I think one of the primary wisdom that comes from Kautilya's Shastra, I generally see him as a grand strategist. And for Kautilya, everything starts from the idea or this entity which we now call the state. I mean, Kautilya would suggest that, no matter what policy options Nepal takes, should in fact be congruent with its own national imperatives, one. Second, Kautilya would again suggest that you need to be flexible and resilient in terms of your foreign policy, because that's one thing. The Shadgunya policy, or the 6 methods of foreign policy. The fact that there are 6 methods actually emphasizes this element of resilience and flexibility. So rigidity in foreign policy is in fact not what Kautilya advocates. Resilience is something that Kautilya would suggest to Nepal. Yes. Over to other speakers.
Dr. Ganguly, would you like to weigh in on that?
I'll just raise 2 points. Though I'm not an expert in Nepal, so I would not talk about the internal dynamics, but looking at Kautilya and looking at how Nepal has been oriented, the internal stability, of a sovereign nation is what is basically Kautilya highlights. And Nepal's internal stability is quite often very much in very disorderly, or you can say there is a lot of internal strife. So internal stability of Nepal is very essential for it to emerge as a very stronger power. And the second thing is what Kautilya would talk about, material and moral well-being. In terms of moral well-being, no context, Nepal is a nation of Buddhas, and I know that there is a lot of ethics and dharma ingrained. But I guess in terms of determining, again, the context in South Asian politics itself is about determining allies and enemies. And a region that is basically in a state of neglect, in a state of not mainstreaming itself yet till now on a lot of areas. The way we have been scientifically, or rather assessing our allies and enemies, are basically the problem areas. So even if Kautilya would highlight that how do you deal with enemy nations or allies, or Mitra's Mitra or Animitra, so you need to understand what Kautilya is trying to put forward, a strategic place that how nations should understand their vicinity. And I think Nepal, India are all both at the same context of not understanding how to deal with the vicinity. So that is what I think I would like to just point out.
Thank you. Dr. Kishore, would you like to chime in, or I can?
No, I think others have answered it. I think
all right.
Nothing that I want to add.
All right, Ms. Chadda, do you have anything to say, or I can move on to the next question?
Thank you. I would just say that, of course, if you read Kautilya's Arthashastra, he's talking about Vijgishu, but at the same time, there is no discrimination in that sense made out between a small state and a large state. So that being said, each state as a sovereign, as an independent entity with its own identity and it owns its own set of interests, as Ms. Anna was mentioning, has all the policy options open to it. And hence it is up to its own judgment as to what it sees closer to achievement of its policy objectives. So I think in that sense, it's a very open field. It's a fair field for Nepal to be able to choose who its friends and partners are in its progress towards development. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So you could utilize different insights from Kautilya's Shastra to actually then see how you behave, right? In terms of, or how do you actually want to project your own influence and identity? But thank you. So the next question, I think, Pramod, how much time do we have? I know we were meant to stop at 6:15 a.m. my time, but could you let me know how much time do we have?
Maybe 5 to 7 more minutes maximum.
Okay, thank you. So I think the next question that comes from Mr. Babu, Nimesh Babu, is very interesting. And I think this is something that I have also grappled with, which is that how and when do you think non-Western international relations theory will gain the prominence, not only in the East, but also in the West? I think this is an interesting conceptual question, because we always make the argument that we need to have non-Western IR. Medha made the point that actually it doesn't have to be a binary, it can be a dialogue between both. But, and still, I think it's a question that we need to answer. And that is, when do you think it'll shift from being an indigenous source of international relations to becoming a text or becoming a conceptual framework of international relations itself? When will you have a panel in the International Studies Association conference that does not put Kautilya on an India panel, but actually puts Kautilya on a panel of international relations theories, like it does for Kenneth Walls or Machiavelli? Medha, please go ahead.
I mean, interesting question, but like if you really look at the extant literature which is there on international relations theory, primarily in the last 10 years or 10 to 12 years, and there were, of course, a few researches or books, even published from 1980s onwards. But I think this team really picked up since 1997. And there is, in fact, a lot of work which has been done on non-Western IR. As one, I would say, scholar, Amitabh Acharya, who's worked on it, he says that it's just taken on different directions. So I would say that when you are actually looking at non-Western, there is already a lot of literature which is available in the public domain. And one can actually characterize it as non-Western, post-Western, post-colonial, and global IR. So where is it that you're really fitting in? So I think we're really we've really gone beyond, the argument that we need to just fit in non-Western thoughts within IR paradigms. I think the debate is much mature now, but there are two ways essentially, I would say, to really have a more progressive debate on doing IR. And this is, by the way, a very contested debate right now because of the growing forces of nationalism, of majoritarianism. So the whole idea of going native or indigenous is seen to be like really in a condescending manner. And therefore, we use the word decolonizing IR. But that besides the point, I would say that there are two ways, yes, in terms of approaching this. The first is empirical. You need to give an agency to say non-Western experiences in terms of, how they do foreign policy. And so there is where I think scholars who are really working on non-Western history and IR, the history of the global South really come into prominence. So there is where the empirical sort of focus lies because the voice of the global South is important. And we are so much shadowed by, I think, the Cold War years or the Congress of Vienna that we don't hear much of, what's really happened in global South. So I think the agency needs to be given to global South. More empirical studies need to be done there. But more importantly, and this is where I think my interest primarily lies, is at a philosophical and a meta-theoretical level. Because if you look at the current debate in the discipline of international relations, there are great debates in international relations. And the fourth and the fifth debate, right now, if we see, is really sort of, trying to respond to this question that whether we need to have, a strict demarcation between positivist and reflectivist tradition. And I think that's very important, rather than, so the whole debate and the question of what is science really, and what is science when it really comes to the discipline of international relations, I think that really needs to be looked at. And there is where I think one can actually look at some of these vantage, the philosophical sort of entry points through which these philosophers or these thinkers were really trying to really think of these issues related to war and peace, in a very different manner. So I think that, both empirical and philosophical is needed. Just being empirical, neglecting the philosophical will always have its consequences. But just focusing on philosophical and not looking at the empirical will also make it very bland and abstract. Over to you, Namrata.
Thank you, Medha. Dr. Ganguly, please.
Just a line of statement that the person has mentioned, that how how do we get this non-Western theorist in international relations. I think we have done profoundly well since the South, which has emerged, and since the Cold War, the global South, we have now Oriental thoughts, we have subaltern thoughts, we have South Asian centers and chairs across the world. So I don't think we are just dependent on the Western philosophy as of what we were complying from Greek and Roman and European context. I think most of global politics today is also determining and taking a lot of citations and references from Asian scholars. So Sun Tzu is an Asian scholar. We have subaltern theories. We have all developmental theories. So I think we are just trying to build on an old question. But I think international relations is already, social constructivism and all of these are already very much influenced by Asian scholarship. So I don't have doubts about how our international relation paradigm is influenced and developed and evolving.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ganguly. That was great. Dr. Kishore, any insights on that?
Yeah, I think rightly put by my predecessors. The problem is also, until and unless, even there was a mention in the comment section I was talking about, that when Shama Shastri discovered and he wanted to do this one, he himself was Western trained. So if one of the examples I can give is the chapter 6, he talks about it as elements of state. But the original part, I've spoken and I've told this innumerable times, it's called Mandala Yonihi. Okay, that's what is in Sanskrit. Mandala Yonihi, I don't know what on earth or how on earth somebody can translate it as elements of state. There's no mention of the word state. There's no, because Sanskrit has multiple meanings, no doubt about it, but none of the meaning is equivalent to the word state. It doesn't even come closer to whatever that's been translated. That's why I insist people to go by Kangle, because he has just translated what is there. He has not interpreted Varta Shastra. He has just given to us so that we look at the text, and you want to interpret, you can interpret, no doubt about it. But there is no methodological, dominance or methodological supremacy that one can establish, because for us also, as part of the tradition, if you look in many of those scholars who worked in India were in the initial stage. Subsequently, only when the Western scholars started writing about it, we started endorsing, and then now a series of works have started on that's where we look at some amount of acceptance from the other side, because we have already accepted the dominance of the Western theories. That has to be accepted. I think I'll bite the bullet and accept that we look forward for endorsement from them, because still IR is a Western dominated subject. And also we all look at, there is nothing wrong in even looking at, which is utilitarian in nature. There is nothing wrong in that one, but as an additional component, we can always use, we can come up with our own interpretations. We can also look at the traditional ways of interpreting certain things where people moved beyond, because now there is a whole movement that's speaking about going beyond the nation's borders and many other things, where these individuals were able to do. That's what my submission in the very initial stage, saying that had he spoken about the mandala or any of those things, speaking specifically to the state that he belonged to, Magadha, it would have been ruined. I don't think he would have been absolutely redundant. He would have not been, there would have not been any value addition. That's precisely why he kept it open, and then he allowed those 72 concentric circles to come even in the mandala. So my submission is that there is no methodological nationalism that is required with regard to Western, the non-Western, but at the same time, we need not also look at endorsement from elsewhere, and we can continue to work on that one. If people find quality in that one, they will naturally start accepting it. This is what I have found with quite a few scholars, because these days there is also a wave where having people from the global South is like a norm. It's like humanizing knowledge, or it's like you're giving space for them to, at least for that sake they're taking. I think a crisis is also an advantage of someone. We can certainly make use of that one. That's my submission. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chadda. I know I can see Pramod. We need to wrap up. So Ms. Chadda, please go ahead. A minute.
Thank you. I'll just take 1 minute to basically add something to what Dr. Kishore was mentioning. Of course, there is no, we do have a framework already in place with the Western IR, but the thing is that the way development is going on, the way globalization is progressing, or let's say retracting, whichever way it is, the idea of development in itself is being questioned. Where is the human security aspect to development, for instance? If you are raising questions of climate change, who is going to address it? Which IR theory really talks about that in a very comprehensive way. And those are the spaces that are naturally opening up, where theories like the indigenous IR theories or IR theories from other parts of the world can come and fit in and talk about a more holistic or a more universal idea of development, where there need not be a unnecessary clash between civilizations, or let's say a clash, or there need not be a clash between a very binary idea of identity, for instance. So I think those are the spaces that are naturally opening up, and it is up to us to take up charge and really progress, and then formulate such a theory, which can be useful in explaining more things. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Chadda, and thank you, Dr. Bisht, Dr. Ganguly, Dr. Kishore, and Ms. Chadda. I really look forward to more work from you. I found this session extremely insightful and learned a lot. And so thank you for your time. And thank you, Pramod, for giving us a little bit extra time. Over to you.
Thank you, Namrata. Distinguished chair and speakers, here we come to the end of the special session on bringing indigenous experience, theories, and philosophies in international relations. We'd like to thank the chairs and speakers for their support and interesting presentation. We wish to organize this event in series. This is the first, so maybe we'll be coming with second and third with a gap of 2 or 3 weeks. We'd like to request all our speakers and audience to join our next session. We also like to request everyone to write something, at least 1,000 to 1,500 words on this, so that we can come with a discussion paper, so that we can compile it. Because I think, like the question Nimesh was asking, that when can West started following or maybe citing the Eastern scholars? I think when we will write about it, when there is rise of Asia, when we'll be writing article on that with the, citing our scholar, then obviously West will be bound to cite our writings and our scholars. So I think that is where we can start from. I would like to thank all our participants for this interesting question as well. We apologize that we could not take everyone questions and could not accommodate everyone in the Zoom room because the participation was beyond our expectations. There was more than 450 registration for this event. But we'll try to find ways to resolve it. We also got 800 people watching us on social media platforms today. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.